In a world where dragons ruled the skies and their shadows stretched endlessly across the land, two brothers spent their lives locked in relentless competition. From their earliest days, they sought to surpass one another, measuring their worth in battles of skill and strength. The rivalry that had begun as mere childhood games soon grew into something far more intense when they both entered the prestigious academy, a place where only the strongest warriors were trained to become dragon slayers. It was there that their fates truly began to diverge. Aesir Donatos, the older brother, was a prodigy in every sense of the word. Every test, every trial, every battle they faced, he excelled effortlessly. His talent was undeniable, his power unmatched. No matter how fierce the challenge, he always rose above it, as if he were destined for greatness from the moment he was born. Teachers praised him, students envied him, and the world seemed to lay itself at his feet. And then there was Rud, the younger brother, always one step behind. No matter how hard he trained, no matter how much effort he poured into honing his skills, he could never quite reach his brother's level. He fought, he struggled, he endured, but the distance between them only grew wider. He was strong, but Aesir Donatos was something beyond strength. He was legendary. And with each failure, with each moment spent in Aesir's overwhelming shadow, Rud's frustration grew. It festered into resentment, a bitterness he could not shake. He hated his brother not because Aesir Donatos had wronged him, but because the world had chosen him, because fate had favored him, because no matter what Rud Donatos did, it would never be enough. Yet, in the grand design of fate, hatred held no power against the forces that shaped their world. When the time came to face the true horrors that awaited them outside the academy, when they stood together on the battlefield where dragons sought to annihilate humanity, everything changed. Their rivalry no longer mattered. Their competition ceased to exist. The moment of truth had arrived, and in that defining moment, Aesir Donatos, the very brother Rud Donatos had spent his life envying, made a choice that shattered everything. He gave his life. Without hesitation, without fear, he threw himself into the jaws of death to save Rud, shielding him from an attack that would have ended his life. In the span of a breath, the brother Rud Donatos had spent years resenting was gone. A man who had been destined for greatness, a warrior whose brilliance had outshone all others, his life was extinguished in an instant. And Rud Donatos was left behind, his heart heavy with grief and guilt. How many years had he wasted, blinded by jealousy? How many moments had he squandered, despising the brother who had loved him without question? But now it was too late. There were no second chances. There was no way to tell Aesir Donatos that he had never truly hated him, that he had admired him all along. The words he wished to say would never be spoken. His brother was gone. Yet the battle was not over. Rud Donatos himself had suffered grievous wounds, his strength fading rapidly as he stood on that blood-stained battlefield. And then, as if summoned by his despair, the final horror emerged from the smoke and fire. The last surviving Dragon Lord, an ancient and terrible force, stepped forward, his presence suffocating, his power undeniable. Rud Donatos knew, without a doubt, that he stood no chance. He was broken, weakened, barely able to stand. Against an enemy of such overwhelming might, victory was impossible. But none of that mattered. With nothing left to lose, with his heart burning with the desire for vengeance, he took up his weapon one last time and charged. It was a battle he could not win, and he knew it. His strikes were met with indifference. His magic barely scratched the enemy before him. The Dragon Lord was beyond human strength, beyond mortal reach. And then, in the final moment, when defeat was certain, the beast unleashed its power. A devastating spell, a blinding force of destruction, consumed everything in its path. There was no pain, only light, and then nothing, death, or so he believed. When his eyes opened again, he was not on the battlefield. The scent of blood and fire had vanished. The cries of the dying had faded into silence. The ruins of war were gone. Instead, he found himself somewhere familiar, too familiar. The academy. He was back. Not as a seasoned warrior, not as the man who had died in battle, but as a student. His body was unscathed, his wounds non-existent. His surroundings were unchanged, as if the war had never happened. And, in truth, it hadn't. He had regressed. Time itself had rewound, placing him at the beginning once more. The weight of that realization crushed him. He had lived through hell, he had lost everything. And yet, here he was, back in a time before it all began. It was a chance, a second chance, a chance to do everything differently, a chance to change fate. As he sat in stunned silence, lost in the gravity of what had happened, a voice interrupted his thoughts, Hanneth Hapley. Red hair, piercing eyes, and a sharp tongue, he recognized her instantly. She had been his friend, one of the many who had fought alongside him, one of the many who had perished in that final battle. She had died. He had seen it with his own eyes. But now, she was standing before him, alive and unharmed. His breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, he forgot how to speak. Instinctively, without thinking, he called out her name. The way he said it, too familiar, too knowing, immediately made her suspicious. She studied him, her expression unreadable. To her, this was their first meeting. To him, it was a reunion with a ghost. She demanded to know how he recognized her, her sharp eyes narrowing as she scrutinized him. Thinking quickly, he covered his mistake, claiming that she was well known due her ranking first in the entrance exams. It was a weak excuse, but it seemed to satisfy her, though not entirely. Still, she dismissed his odd behavior with a remark about his strangeness, muttering that he seemed somewhat deranged. She had always been blunt, never one to hold back her thoughts, and yet Rud Donatos only smiled, because she was alive, and that was all that mattered. He took the seat beside her, his mind still racing, still trying to process the weight of everything. The entrance ceremony would soon begin, just as it had before. Everything was unfolding as it once had, as his memories dictated. He knew what would happen next. He knew that his brother, Aesir Donatos, would soon take the stage as the student council president. That was how it had happened before. That was how it was supposed to happen. But as the ceremony continued, something went wrong. Instead of Aesir Donatos, another figure ascended the podium. Jeremy Duville, Aesir's best friend. He introduced himself as the student council president, delivering the speech meant for his brother. Rud's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it had happened before. His heart pounded as the realization set in. Something had changed. This wasn't just a simple repetition of the past. He had returned, but fate had already shifted. And if something as fundamental as his brother's position had changed, then what else had? What else had been rewritten? A cold dread settled in his chest. The future he had known was no longer certain. The war, the battles, the losses. What if things unfolded differently? What if this time, something even worse was waiting for him? Confusion churned in Rud's mind, a deep unease settling in his chest as he struggled to comprehend his brother's absence. The moment Jeremy had taken the stage instead of Aesir Donatos, something inside him had twisted. A realization creeping in that something had shifted in this timeline, something crucial. As the entrance ceremony concluded and the students began to disperse, Rud Donatos found himself moving on instinct, his feet carrying him toward Jeremy. His mind burned with questions, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He had to know the truth. He approached Jeremy directly, his voice steady but demanding, asking without hesitation about air. The response he received sent a cold shiver down his spine. Jeremy's expression was blank, uncomprehending. He didn't know who Aesir Donatos was. He didn't recognize the name at all. The world seemed to tilt around Rud Donatos as a terrifying thought took hold of him, one that he could barely bring himself to accept. In this world, in this altered version of the past, his brother might not exist at all. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Either Aesir's existence had been completely erased, wiped from history as if he had never been born, or there was another explanation, one just as unsettling. If Aesir Donatos had also been sent back in time with his memories intact, then perhaps he had chosen not to attend the academy this time, altering his own path in ways Rud Donatos could not yet comprehend. The weight of these possibilities made his head spin. The sound of the school bell rang, marking the official end of the ceremony. Around him, the freshmen moved with purpose, heading to their first classes of the day, their laughter and chatter filling the halls. But Rud Donatos remained rooted in place, frozen in his thoughts, his mind unable to let go of the gaping hole where his brother should have been. His breathing felt uneven, his pulse quickening as he tried to think of what to do next. He needed to confirm the truth for himself, needed to find proof that Aesir Donatos had either vanished or was still somewhere in this world. He couldn't let himself be paralyzed by uncertainty. A voice broke through his thoughts, drawing his attention. Henneth had approached him, her sharp gaze studying his face with mild concern. She had noticed his distraction, and in her usual blunt manner, she asked what was on his mind, what was making him look so lost in thought. He hesitated for only a second before answering simply that he was looking for someone. Henneth, ever practical, offered an immediate suggestion he should submit a request to the Information Guild or check the library's records. If the person he was searching for was a student, there was bound to be some documentation. But before she could even finish speaking, Rud Donatos had already turned and headed straight for the library, his urgency overriding any sense of politeness. Behind him, Henneth huffed in annoyance at being ignored, calling after him as she followed, her complaints loud and clear about his complete lack of manners. When they arrived at the central library, Henneth slowed to take in the grand architecture, her expression shifting to one of awe. The towering shelves, the intricate carvings on the walls, the sheer scale of the knowledge housed within it was clear she had never seen anything like it before. But Rud Donatos had no time to admire the scenery. His focus was singular. Without pause, he turned to her, asking how she had managed to find the library so quickly on her first day. Henneth smirked. her confidence shining through as she explained that she had memorized the school map before arriving. Donatos barely acknowledged her response, his mind too occupied to engage in small talk. He went straight to the record section, scanning through the names of current and past students. He had never stepped foot in the library in his first life. There had never been a reason to. But now, he searched with a sense of urgency, his fingers flipping through the records with growing desperation. He checked every listing, every student registry, every possible place where his brother's name should have been recorded. And yet, there was nothing. No mention of Aer, no records, no history. It was as if he had never existed at all. A cold, numbing realization dawned on him. This wasn't a simple case of Aesir Donatos missing. Something had erased him entirely. His thoughts raced back to the final battle of his past life. He remembered the moment Aesir's body had vanished. The way Sartan, the dimension dragon, had disappeared with him. A creature capable of manipulating space and time. Was it possible that Sartan had done something far beyond mere death? If Aesir Donatos wasn't here, if he wasn't recorded in this world, then the most terrifying possibility was that he had been transported to an entirely different timeline. Rudd's mind reeled. If that was the case, then his brother wasn't just missing, he was somewhere else entirely, lost in a place that Rudd Donatos had no way of reaching. His thoughts were abruptly cut off by Henneth's voice. He turned to see her locked in an argument with the librarian, her arms crossed as she stubbornly insisted on borrowing 17 books. The librarian, unimpressed by her demands, reminded her of the library's policy: freshmen were only allowed to check out 3 books at a time. She grumbled but ultimately selected her 3, shooting a glare in Rudd's direction as if this was somehow his fault. As they left the library together, she muttered complaints under her breath, but Rudd Donatos barely registered them. His mind was too consumed by the mystery of his brother's disappearance. Back in the classroom, as their first official lesson began, Henneth once again prodded him for information. Had he found anything on the person he was searching for? When he hesitated, she pushed further, offering again that the Information Guild might be his best chance at finding them. Eventually, Rudd Donatos revealed the truth: he was searching for his older brother. The words felt strange leaving his mouth, a bitter confirmation of what he had just discovered. But before the conversation could go any deeper, the classroom fell silent as their instructor entered. Daniel Gua. The name sent murmurs through the room, students whispering among themselves in excitement. A top-ranked warrior, widely respected and admired, Daniel Gua was not just a teacher, he was a legend. As he introduced himself, he spoke with the confidence of a man who had seen countless battles, his presence commanding attention. He assured the students that with enough dedication, they would all find their strengths, that true talent could only be unlocked through effort and perseverance. As the students listened in admiration, Rudd Donatos reflected on those words with quiet bitterness. In his past life, he had endured humiliation after humiliation, struggling for years to uncover his abilities. He had learned firsthand that talent alone meant nothing without the will to survive. When the class ended, Rudd Donatos wasted no time. He left immediately, heading straight for the training ground he had often used in his previous life. He needed to confirm the limits of his current body. He had been given a second chance, but that meant nothing if he wasn't strong enough to change the future. As he began a set of pull-ups, he quickly realized just how weak his younger body was. He lacked the endurance he had once built, the hardened strength of a seasoned warrior. The memory of the upcoming sparring class in a week sent a sense of urgency through him. He needed to improve, and fast. He could not afford to repeat his past failures. Determined, he decided to focus on building his strength and stamina, recognizing them as his greatest assets in the battles to come. As he continued his training, he noticed another student nearby, one he recognized, Balak Steros. In his past life, Balak had been a friend, a warrior who would go on to earn the title King of Fists. But this timeline was different. Rudd Donatos had never seen Balak at this training center before, not this early. In his previous life, he had only met him after midterm exams, when he began frequenting the advanced training grounds. But here he was now, earlier than before, unknowingly stepping into Rudd's altered path. Another change, another divergence from the past. The pieces were shifting, and Rudd Donatos had no choice but to keep moving forward. As Rudd Donatos continued his exercises, he couldn't shake the small nagging doubt in the back of his mind. The presence of Balak at the training center this early in the timeline was unexpected. It wasn't something that should have happened, not yet. If events were already shifting in subtle ways, could it mean that his presence, his regression, was altering the course of history more than he had anticipated? He considered it for a moment, wondering if something had gone fundamentally wrong with the timeline, but ultimately decided against dwelling on it. Worrying about these deviations would get him nowhere. Right now, his priority was strengthening his body, adapting to his younger self's current limitations, and preparing for the inevitable battles ahead. As he pushed himself further into his routine, however, he couldn't ignore the strange feeling of being watched. He caught a glimpse of Balak out of the corner of his eye, his large, muscular frame still and focused. But it wasn't just that Balak was watching, he was mimicking. Every movement Rud Donatos made, Balak repeated. Each exercise he performed, Balak mirrored. The difference was, Balak was using heavier weights, pushing himself to even greater extremes. At first, Rud Donatos ignored it, thinking it was a coincidence or that Balak was simply adjusting his own workout routine. But as the pattern continued, Rud Donatos could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. Annoyed, he finally turned to Balak and confronted him directly, demanding to know if he was trying to pick a fight. Balak, however, only gave a calm response, stating that he was simply exercising. He admitted that he had been copying Rud's movements, but not out of competition or mockery. He found Rud's form flawless, something he had never seen before. In fact, he marveled at it, calling Rud's movements beautiful. He even went so far as to say that no one in his family, not even his father, had ever demonstrated such precision. The sheer earnestness in his tone took Rud Donatos aback. He had expected some kind of challenge, some provocation, but Balak's admiration was genuine. The two formally introduced themselves, and to Rud's surprise, Balak then asked if Rud Donatos could be his guide in physical training from now on. He claimed with absolute certainty that someday, Rud's physique would surpass his own in both muscularity and definition. Rud bluntly refused. Meanwhile, at the Irium outdoor training grounds, students gathered around the weapons racks where various arms were displayed. Professor Denel stood at the front, overseeing the selection process, his authoritative gaze sweeping across the gathered first-year students. One by one, they began picking their weapons, testing the weight and grip, gauging which felt most natural in their hands. Rud Donatos approached the racks with careful deliberation, his mind already made up. He reached for a sword, the familiar weight settling in his grasp like an old companion. As he held it, his attention was drawn to Henneth, who was speaking with Professor Danel, questioning whether she even needed to select a weapon at all. Since she planned to become a magician, she saw little point in equipping herself with something she would never use. Professor Danel, however, was firm in his stance. He explained that even magicians must be prepared for the unpredictability of battle. Spells could fail, mana could be drained, and in such moments, a weapon could mean the difference between survival and death. A magician without a weapon was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Henneth frowned, clearly unconvinced, but before she could argue further, Rud Donatos stepped in, offering his own advice. He suggested she choose a dagger, explaining that it suited her best as a magician. A dagger was light, easy to conceal, and could be quickly adjusted using magic, making it a versatile tool in combat. His reasoning was not random. He knew from his past life that Henneth had an incredible natural skill with daggers. Though she had never considered it a primary weapon, it had saved her life countless times in battle. Henneth studied him for a moment before nodding. She turned back to the weapon rack and selected a dagger, running her fingers along its blade as if testing its balance. Meanwhile, Rud Donatos began testing the weight of his sword, swinging it with practiced ease. The moment the blade cut through the air, Professor Danel's eyes locked onto him. His expression shifted from casual interest to outright astonishment. That single swing, it was too perfect, too refined. It was not the movement of a novice, nor even that of an ordinary academy student. It was the swing of a seasoned swordsman, one who had spent years perfecting their craft. Henneth, still intrigued by Rud's choices, suggested he try out some other weapons. But Professor Danel was already captivated by what he had just witnessed. There was no need for further tests. Rud Donatos had already displayed a level of skill far beyond his years. Yet Rud Donatos himself was not satisfied with just the sword. He turned to Professor Danel and asked if he could choose multiple weapons. The request made Danel pause. Was Rud Donatos trying to show off? Or was there a deeper reason behind his confidence? Something about this student was unusual, and Danel resolved to keep an eye on him. Without waiting for an answer, Rud Donatos moved toward the spears. He picked one up, testing its weight before executing a flawless arc swing. The motion was precise, fluid, and controlled, the kind of strike that only came from someone who had fought with a spear in real battle. Danel's expression darkened with intrigue. Then Rud Donatos set the spear down and took up a longsword. Another strike, perfect form, flawless technique. The realization settled in Danel's mind. These were Rud's three main weapons. He wasn't just proficient, he was experienced. But how? Danel could no longer hold back his curiosity. He stepped forward and asked Rud Donatos directly what he had done before coming to the academy. Without hesitation, Rud Donatos replied that he had worked as a mercenary, forced to make a living after his family was killed by a dragon. The response caught Danel off guard. He immediately apologized for prying into something so personal, but the story had already taken root in his mind. This student was no ordinary freshman. Henneth, who had been listening in from nearby, hesitated for a moment before approaching. She had always been blunt, never one to mince words, but this time she surprised Rud. Instead of her usual sharp remarks, she quietly apologized for bringing up such a painful subject. Rud Donatos was momentarily taken aback. He had never expected kindness from her, not in this form. Meanwhile, across the training grounds, an argument erupted between Professor Mason and a student from Class B. At the center of the dispute stood Balak Steros. Mason was insistent Balak needed to choose a weapon, but Balak stood firm, arms crossed, refusing outright. He declared that the Steros family did not use weapons. It was a deeply ingrained tradition, an unbreakable principle. His unwavering stance only fueled Mason's frustration. As the argument grew more heated, Professor Donnell stepped in, putting an end to the dispute. He addressed Balak directly, making it clear that even if the Steros family refused to wield weapons, this was an academy. Rules had to be followed. Weapon training was mandatory, and if Balak refused to participate, he would face expulsion. Rudd, overhearing the exchange, was stunned. This was not how things had played out in his past life. Back then, an exception had been made for Balak. He had never been forced to take up a weapon. But now, things were different. Another deviation from the timeline. Balak, unfazed by the threat of expulsion, turned and spotted Rudd. With a casual confidence he approached, his easygoing demeanor unchanged. Henneth, watching the encounter unfold, raised an eyebrow and asked if Rudd Donatos was friends with Balak. Rudd Donatos immediately denied it, but Balak, with his usual carefree nature, simply grinned and began explaining their odd relationship. Before Rudd Donatos could protest, he found himself reluctantly acknowledging that, yes, they were in fact friends. From a distance, Professor Mason seethed, his frustration mounting. First, Balak had defied him. Now he was getting along with the very student who had caught Professor Daniel's attention. The pieces were shifting, and whether Rudd Donatos liked it or not, the world was changing around him. Rudd stood amidst the murmurs of his fellow students, his mind still processing the fight that had just unfolded. The timeline had shifted once again, and he knew that every action he took had the potential to create ripples that could alter the future in unforeseen ways. As he watched Wilm's unconscious body being dragged away, his thoughts drifted back to the confrontation itself. He had responded differently this time, more calculated, more controlled. In his past life, he had relied solely on brute force to deal with situations like these, answering violence with violence, but now, he had exercised restraint. The decision had paid off, yet there was still the undeniable fact that he had performed a technique far beyond what he should have been capable of in the eyes of others. The Steros family's bare fist parry was an advanced martial skill, one that even Balak himself had not yet mastered. Rudd Donatos had used it instinctively, drawing upon the experience ingrained in his body from a lifetime that no longer existed. The moment had passed too quickly for most to comprehend, but Balak had recognized it immediately. He had known that what Rudd Donatos had done should have been impossible. As the tension settled and the gathered students dispersed, Professor Mason issued a final instruction, calling Rudd Donatos to the faculty office after class. It was an inevitable consequence, but Rudd Donatos felt no anxiety over it. The situation had been handled cleanly, and with Henneth and Balak both testifying in his favor, there would be no repercussions for him, at least, none that would affect his standing in the academy. Instead, his focus remained on what the fight had revealed. His ability to wield past life knowledge so seamlessly. The way he had executed the parry without hesitation, it confirmed what he already suspected. His memories were not just preserved, they were deeply embedded in his muscle memory as well. He was, in every sense, a warrior who had regressed, carrying with him the experience of countless battles. This was an advantage unlike any other, but it also posed a risk. If he continued to display skills far beyond his years, those around him would begin to question him. He would need to be more careful, more deliberate in how he revealed his abilities. Standing out was necessary to secure his future, but revealing too much could bring unwanted attention. As he, Balak, and Henneth walked away from the scene, the air between them was filled with unspoken thoughts. Henneth's usual sharp wit had been subdued by a rare flicker of curiosity, her mind undoubtedly replaying what she had witnessed. Balak, on the other hand, was staring at Rudd Donatos with an expression of intrigue, the gears in his mind turning as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The fact that Balak had not yet learned the technique in this timeline meant that Rudd Donatos had, in essence, surpassed him in his own family's martial style. It was an outcome that should have been impossible, and yet it had happened right in front of him. There was no way Balak would simply brush it aside. He was the type to seek answers, to analyze and learn from what he observed. Rudd Donatos knew that this would not be the last time Balak brought it up. Their dynamic had already begun to shift, another divergence from the past. As they reached the training grounds, Rudd Donatos glanced at the class schedule once more. The first week at the academy was designed to allow new students to adjust, but he knew from experience that it was also the time when the professors actively observed their students, taking note of who held potential. He had already ensured that he stood out during the weapons selection session, securing a strong first impression with Professor Daniel. Now, with the fight against Wilm adding yet another layer to his reputation, he had established himself as someone worth keeping an eye on. That was exactly what he had intended, yet he also knew that attention alone was not enough. He needed to be prepared for the upcoming sparring class, an event that would serve as the first real test of his abilities. In his past life, that class had been a turning point for many students, a moment where weaknesses were exposed, strengths were recognized, and rivalries were solidified. This time, he intended to use it to his advantage. Henneth, still dwelling on Balak's near expulsion, continued to berate him for his stubbornness, her voice sharp as she reprimanded him for risking his future over a matter of pride. Balak, unbothered by her words, remained as composed as ever, responding with nothing more than a smirk. Rudd, though not particularly invested in their argument, couldn't ignore the weight of what had nearly happened. If Balak had truly been expelled, the future battles would have played out differently. The war against the Dragon Lords, the fate of those who had once fought beside him, it would have all changed. His presence in this timeline was already shifting events, but that was not necessarily a bad thing. He could use this opportunity to correct past mistakes, to strengthen his allies before the war ever began. Balak's potential had always been immense, but now, Rudd Donatos had the chance to ensure that he reached his peak even earlier. As he formulated his next steps, another realization crept into his mind. If even minor decisions were altering the future, then what of Air? His brother's absence had already thrown everything off balance. In his past life, Aesir Donatos had been the student council president, a figure of immense influence within the academy. But now, that role belonged to Jeremy Duville. The fact that no one even remembered Aesir's existence meant that something or someone had deliberately removed him from this timeline. Rudd Donatos could not ignore the possibility that Sartan, the Dimension Dragon, was involved. That thought alone sent a chill down his spine. If Aesir Donatos was trapped in another timeline, lost in a space beyond his reach, then finding him would not be as simple as searching Academy records. He would need more information, more clues. The truth would not reveal itself easily, but one thing was certain: he would not stop until he uncovered what had happened. For now, however, his priority remained on strengthening himself and those around him. He had 1 week before the sparring class, 1 week to prepare himself and ensure that he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. His current body was far weaker than the one he had trained to its peak in his past life, but that only meant he had to accelerate his growth. He had the knowledge, the experience, and the awareness of what lay ahead. He would not waste this second chance. Every moment, every action, every decision, it all had to be intentional. The world was shifting around him, and whether the changes were for better or worse, he was determined to be the one who shaped the outcome. As they walked, the tension of the previous fight slowly dissipated, though the impact it had left lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Film had been a small obstacle, a mere annoyance in the grand scheme of things, but the encounter had served its purpose. Rudd Donatos had tested his restraint, had proven his ability, and had established himself as someone not to be underestimated. But it had also raised questions that Balak would not let go of anytime soon. The way he kept glancing at Rudd, analyzing him as if he were a puzzle waiting to be solved, made it clear that their interactions were far from over. Rudd Donatos had changed the course of their relationship in this timeline, and with it, the foundation of their future alliance. As the academy loomed ahead, Rudd Donatos took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no room for complacency. The timeline was already different, and more changes would come. He would need to stay ahead, to anticipate every shift, to ensure that the future he was moving toward was one where they would all survive. No longer bound by the failures of his past, he would forge a new path, and this time, he would not lose the people he cared about. Rudd hesitated for a brief moment, caught off guard by Balak's unexpected question. The thought of being Balak's secret little brother was so absurd that he nearly laughed, but he knew he had to tread carefully. There was no way he could reveal the truth, that he had learned Balak's own technique, not through training in this life, but from their battles together in a past one. The knowledge belonged to an older Balak, one who had fought alongside him, one who had died in the war against the Dragon Lords. The mere thought of explaining that truth was impossible, so instead, he brushed it off casually, throwing on an air of arrogance and claiming that he was simply a genius. He didn't need a complicated explanation if confidence could serve as a shield. Balak, though skeptical, seemed willing to accept the excuse, at least for the time being. As if on cue, Henneth and Balak resumed their bickering, their voices rising in irritation. Balak continued to push his claim that they were friends, while Henneth, as stubborn as ever, shot him down with sharp remarks. Their exchange was so familiar that Rudd Donatos found himself momentarily lost in nostalgia. In his past life, the two of them had always argued like this. It was a never-ending pattern, one that had existed up until the very end. No matter how dire their circumstances had become, no matter how close they had stood to death, their dynamic had never changed. And here, in this rewritten timeline, it remained the same. Some things, it seemed, were unshakable, anchored in fate itself. As their voices faded into the background, Rudd Donatos made a quiet decision: he would skip his next class. His mind wasn't on lectures or training schedules. Right now, his thoughts were consumed by something far more pressing. He had been given a second chance, a rare and unpredictable gift. And in his previous life, too many of the people he cared about had died. He had been too weak, too slow, too unprepared. But this time he would not make the same mistakes. This time he would ensure that things played out differently. Heneth, Balak, Aesir Donatos. None of them would meet the same tragic ends. Not if he had anything to say about it. Stepping out of the faculty office, Rud Donatos took in a deep breath, the air cool against his skin. His meeting with Professor Mason had gone as expected, though he had been prepared for far worse. Initially she had intended to scold him, likely wanting to make an example of him for causing a disturbance. However, Rud Donatos had carefully crafted his response, presenting himself as nothing more than a humble and apologetic student. His demeanor had been measured, his words calculated, and his tone disarmingly sincere. He had diffused the situation so effectively that Mason had been taken aback, her initial irritation melting into something more akin to grudging respect. Rather than chastising him further, she had turned her focus toward Vilm, her irritation now directed at the troublemaker who had caused the incident in the first place. Rud Donatos could tell she was already plotting how to deal with Vilm once the next training session began. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the academy, the faculty meeting for the first-year professors was underway. Professor Donnell had taken charge of the discussion, summarizing the overall performance of the new students. He noted that, compared to previous years, this batch of first years showed skill levels higher than expected. The statement was met with mixed reactions. Professor Mason, always one to challenge optimism with hard truths, interjected, reminding the group that skill alone was never enough to determine success. Persistence, she argued, was just as important, if not more so. Professor Arthur Winston, responsible for Class D and ever the optimist, countered that perseverance was something they, as professors, were responsible for fostering. Even those lacking natural talent could be shaped into great warriors if given proper guidance. The discussion shifted toward standout students, with Professor Arthur expressing curiosity about whether any individuals in the current cohort showed extraordinary promise. Professor Damon Grace, overseeing Class C, responded with measured neutrality, stating that while his students were competent, none had displayed anything truly remarkable thus far. In contrast, Professor Mason brought up two names from Class B Vilm, whom she referred to as a bad apple, and Balak, whom she described as a crazy kid, too stubborn to pick up a weapon. She recalled that although Balak's written exam had been a disaster, his performance in practical combat had set him apart. Professor Donnell then brought up two students from his own class, Heneth Hapla, who came from a lineage of powerful magicians, and Rud Donatos, a student who had already begun to show potential in multiple areas. As the faculty examined Rud's profile, initial impressions were unremarkable. His written and practical exam scores were average. His background as a former mercenary with no surviving family seemed unexceptional, and there was nothing on paper that would immediately mark him as a prodigy. However, Professor Donnell, having observed Rud Donatos closely since the beginning, spoke up. He cautioned the others against underestimating Rud Donatos based solely on his records. There was something different about him, something that was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Even Professor Mason, who rarely praised students openly, seemed caught off guard. Yet, despite her initial reservations, she found herself agreeing in part. She admitted that Rud Donatos had impressed her not just with his combat ability, but with his conduct. He had handled himself with remarkable poise during the incident with Vilm, diffusing the situation with the faculty while simultaneously proving his skill by taking down an armed opponent with nothing but his bare hands. That kind of control, both in combat and in behavior, was rare. Rud Donatos excelled in close-quarters combat, and if his performance so far was anything to judge by, he had the potential to become a formidable fighter. As the discussion deepened, a rare disagreement arose among the professors. Some argued that Rud's background and test scores did not support the idea that he was exceptional, while others pointed out that written exams were hardly an accurate measure of combat potential. Professor Mason, usually one to maintain a composed demeanor, found herself nearly engaging in a verbal altercation with Donnell over the topic. The room was divided. Some saw Rud Donatos as an anomaly, an unpredictable factor whose true capabilities were yet to be understood, while others viewed him as a promising but ultimately unproven talent. Donnell, however, remained firm in his stance. He had seen the way Rud Donatos moved, the precision in his strikes, the calculated nature of his decisions. That level of skill did not come from someone who was simply above average. There was something deeper there, something the Academy had not yet realized. And as the discussion continued, one thing became clear whether the professors believed in him yet or not. Rud Donatos had already begun to make an impression. His presence was being acknowledged, his potential was being debated, and whether the faculty knew it or not, they had just started watching the rise of someone who would change everything. The faculty room remained tense as the discussion over Rud's placement escalated. each professor advocating for their own reasoning on why they should or should not retain him in their respective classes. Professor Donnell, convinced of Rudd's immense potential, was adamant that he belonged in his class. He had witnessed firsthand Rudd's precision, his adaptability, and his combat instincts that surpassed those of a normal student. He believed that nurturing such a talent was his responsibility, especially considering the path Rudd Donatos was inevitably walking. Professor Mason, while less vocal in her arguments, also saw value in keeping Rudd Donatos within her sphere of influence. His composure, humility, and ability to handle himself in combat had impressed her, and while she was normally hesitant to openly praise students, she recognized that Rudd Donatos was not just another talented fighter, he had the potential to be something more. She wasn't about to lose track of a student who had already made such an impact. However, before the argument could escalate further, Professor Arthur Winston slammed his fist against the table, the sharp sound cutting through the heated discussion like a blade. His voice, filled with authority and frustration, demanded that they compose themselves and act like proper professors instead of squabbling over a student. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Donnell and Mason reluctantly settled down, the tension between them still palpable. With a deep breath, Arthur redirected the conversation back to Rudd, shifting his gaze to Professor Damon Grace for his opinion. Professor Damon, ever the detached observer, responded with little interest, stating that he wasn't particularly invested in Rudd's potential one way or the other. His expression remained unreadable, masked behind his usual air of indifference, making it clear that he would not fight for Rudd's placement. His lack of enthusiasm was not surprising. Damon was known for his analytical yet aloof nature, a professor who rarely formed attachments or took special interest in any of his students. Arthur himself showed a flicker of curiosity, but ultimately sided with the belief that it was up to Rudd Donatos to decide which professor would guide him. However, as they continued discussing his background, a startling revelation came to light, one that shifted the tone of the conversation entirely. Arthur uncovered a detail in Rudd's records that had gone unnoticed until now. He was from Desol, a village that no longer existed, a place that had vanished due to the ever-changing incident a decade ago. The room grew still at the mention of that tragedy. The ever-changing incident had been one of the most catastrophic events in the kingdom's history, resulting in the complete collapse of Calavan, a once prosperous kingdom that had lost half its territory and eventually faded from the map altogether. The primary cause of Calavan's downfall had been the emergence of a powerful and nightmarish creature, the Dragon Canal, a being that could transform into anything, making it nearly impossible to kill. The revelation struck a deep chord with Professor Donnell, who had been part of the expedition tasked with slaying the Dragon Canal. Memories of that battle surfaced vividly in his mind. The overwhelming power of the dragon, the desperate struggle to restrain it, and the loss of countless lives. He recalled how his own teacher had been the one to finally kill the beast, though at the time he had been a mere newcomer, only capable of holding down its ankle as the battle raged on. Now, learning that Rudd Donatos came from Desol, a village that had been wiped off the map by that same catastrophe, Donnell found himself wondering, was Rudd Donatos driven by revenge? Had the destruction of his home ignited an unquenchable fire within him, pushing him to become stronger? While Donnell saw Rudd's potential with increasing clarity, Professor Arthur remained skeptical. He acknowledged that Rudd Donatos was undoubtedly skilled, but he was not entirely convinced that he was the strongest student in the first-year class. There was another student, one in Class D, whom Arthur referred to as a monster-like genius. This student, unnamed for now, reportedly possessed extraordinary abilities, making them a direct competitor for the title of the strongest. The possibility of another student of such caliber being in the same year as Rudd Donatos made things even more interesting. If Rudd Donatos was to rise to prominence, he would not only have to surpass his former self, but also this mysterious prodigy who had yet to reveal their true strength. Meanwhile, across the training grounds, the first-year students continued their rigorous exercises, some thriving under the pressure, others struggling under the relentless supervision of their instructors. Among them was Vilm, whose arrogance had earned him the ire of Professor Mason. Under her strict and merciless training, Vilm groaned in exhaustion, his body covered in sweat as he struggled to complete another set of push-ups. But Mason was unrelenting. The moment he finished one set, she ordered him to start another, offering no reprieve. Her methods were harsh, but they had a purpose. She was determined to break his ego, to forge him into something stronger than his current self. On the other side of the training grounds, Rudd Donatos was finishing his own set of exercises, quietly assessing his progress. His body was adapting, his movements growing more fluid, and he was gradually reacquainting himself with the breathing technique he had mastered in his past life. With only 3 days left until the sparring class, he knew he had made significant improvements. His younger body was weaker than what he was used to, but his experience allowed him to refine his form and efficiency at an accelerated rate. Every moment of training was a step toward regaining the power he once had. Nearby, Balak grunted loudly as he lifted weights. his heavy breathing echoing across the training area. Rudd, irritated by the unnecessary noise, turned to him with a sharp glance. Balak's form was slightly off every time he let out a loud grunt. His balance shifted, causing his posture to tilt to one side. The flaw was minor, but it was enough to make his exercise less effective. Without hesitation, Rudd Donatos called him out on it, instructing him to stop making so much noise and focus on his posture. Balak, momentarily pausing, adjusted himself as Rudd Donatos advised, and to his surprise, he immediately felt the difference. His muscles engaged more efficiently, and the exercise became noticeably more effective. Recognizing the improvement, Balak grinned and complimented Rudd, calling him the best teacher he had ever had. Rudd Donatos merely nodded in acknowledgement, his focus remaining on his own training rather than indulging in Balak's praise. As they continued, Henneth approached, her nose wrinkled in mild disgust. The overwhelming scent of sweat in the training area made her visibly uncomfortable, and with her usual sharp tongue, she commented on how unnatural it was for them to be exercising for such an extended period without collapsing from exhaustion. She playfully questioned whether Rudd Donatos and Balak were even human, remarking that normal people would have given up long ago. Ever the optimist, Balak took her remark as an opportunity, cheerfully offering to help her build muscle as well, suggesting that she start with calisthenics. Henneth, unimpressed, immediately rolled her eyes, clearly unwilling to entertain the idea. As expected, their exchange quickly turned into another bickering session, their back and forth so familiar that it felt almost scripted. It was the same dynamic Rudd Donatos had seen in his past life, the same banter, the same stubbornness. Despite the petty arguments, Rudd Donatos felt a strange sense of comfort in seeing them like this. It was a reminder that not everything had to be a battle, that even with the weight of fate pressing down on him, moments like these still existed. But deep in his mind, he knew that the peace of the academy would not last forever. The sparring class was approaching, and beyond that, the true trials awaited. For now, though, he allowed himself to focus on the present, to take in the familiar interactions of those who would one day fight by his side. They had no idea what awaited them, but he did. And he would do everything in his power to make sure that when the time came, they would be ready. Rudd, feeling the strain of his training, decided it was time for a break and mentioned to Henneth that he was going to grab something to drink. Henneth, ever curious and eager to escape the overwhelming scent of sweat lingering in the training grounds, decided to tag along without waiting for an invitation. Balak, however, was undeterred by their departure, continuing his rigorous exercises without pause. His only request was that they bring him a protein shake when they returned. Rudd Donatos rolled his eyes at the request but didn't argue, already accustomed to Balak's relentless approach to training. The two made their way toward the academy's vending machines, the cool shade of the corridor providing temporary relief from the intense heat of the training grounds. Upon reaching the vending machines, Rudd Donatos immediately noticed a figure standing nearby. A silver-haired woman was casually sipping a drink, her posture relaxed but exuding a presence that sent a jolt of recognition through him. He knew exactly who she was, Leon Creer, a master swordswoman with an almost supernatural level of talent, one of the few people who had ever completely overwhelmed him in battle. Memories from his past life surged back, a bitter recollection of the harsh lesson she had taught him. Leon Creer had once demonstrated with terrifying clarity that no matter how much effort one put in, there were simply those who were born superior. She was a natural, her talent bordering on the absurd, and no amount of training could bridge the gap between them. The memory left an irritation simmering beneath his skin, and without thinking, he coldly ordered her to move aside. Ryan, rather than being offended, merely raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. With a mischievous glint, she suddenly threw her half-finished drink at him. Reacting on instinct, Rudd Donatos dodged effortlessly, but before he could retaliate, she vanished from sight. A split second later, she reappeared behind him, launching a swift kick aimed directly at his side. He barely managed to block it in time, but the sheer force of the impact rattled him, sending a sharp sting up his arm. Without giving him a moment to recover, she followed up with another attack. But this time, he saw it coming and avoided it, surprising her. She halted her offensive, studying him with mild curiosity, her posture relaxed as if she were merely toying with him. A brief pause stretched between them before he finally pointed out the obvious: she was blocking the vending machine. Leon Creer blinked, realizing her mistake, and with an almost flustered expression stepped aside and offered an offhand apology. However, her interest in him had clearly been piqued. She asked for his name, and after a moment of hesitation, he gave it. Nodding thoughtfully, she mentioned that she would remember it before walking off, leaving Rudd Donatos standing there with a lingering irritation that refused to fade. As soon as she was gone, a sharp pain flared in his wrist, the same one he had used to block her kick. At first, he tried to ignore it, unwilling to acknowledge any injury, but the throbbing only grew more persistent. Henneth, who had been watching the entire encounter, immediately noticed his discomfort. Without giving him a chance to protest, she forcefully pushed him toward the nurse's office, insisting that he get it checked. Rudd, reluctant to admit any form of weakness, sighed in resignation but allowed himself to be dragged along. Soon after, he was seen with his wrist wrapped in a bandage, a physical reminder of his encounter with Ryan. However, what should have been a minor incident quickly spiraled out of control as news of what had happened spread like wildfire throughout the academy. Henneth, ever the instigator, eagerly relayed the story to Professor Daniel and Professor Mason, though her retelling exaggerated the event to a frustrating degree. Rather than stating that Rude Donatos had merely defended against Ryan, she claimed that he had been completely beaten by her, framing the situation as if he had been utterly humiliated. Professor Mason, upon hearing this, immediately bristled with irritation. Her temper flared at the thought of a student like Leon Creer going around challenging others without reason. Given Rion's history of provoking fights, Mason's frustration only grew, and she expressed a strong desire to confront her directly. The surrounding students quickly picked up on the gossip, whispering among themselves about Rudd's so-called defeat. He could feel the embarrassment creeping in, wishing that the entire ordeal had been kept quiet. However, before Mason could act on her frustration, Professor Daniel intervened with his usual calm demeanor. He pointed out that if Mason personally went to yell at Rion, it would cause an unnecessary power struggle between the faculty. Leon Creer was under the jurisdiction of Professor Arthur Winston, the head of Class D, and if Mason overstepped by handling the matter herself, it would undermine Arthur's authority. Instead, Daniel suggested a different approach. They could report the incident to the captain of the Dragon Slayers, Ryan's guardian, who was known for her strict professionalism. If she got involved, there was no doubt that she would ensure Leon Creer faced consequences. Furthermore, once disciplinary actions were taken, Mason could redirect the blame toward Arthur, ensuring that the situation was resolved in a way that maintained the Academy's structure. Despite the logical solution, Rude Donatos still felt unsettled by the fact that nearly everyone now knew about the encounter. It wasn't about losing to Leon Creer. He understood her overwhelming skill better than most, but the way it was being framed made it seem like he had been utterly outclassed. Balak, noticing Rud's discomfort, attempted to console him in his usual friendly manner, but Rude Donatos quickly brushed him off, telling him to shut up. The last thing he needed was for Balak to make it worse with his attempts at encouragement. 3 days passed, and soon the long-anticipated sparring class arrived. The first-year students gathered in formation, standing alongside their respective classes as the combined session for classes A and B officially commenced. The air was thick with tension and excitement, as the sparring session would serve as the first real test of their abilities in front of the professors. Each student was assigned a number, and the system allowed them to choose their opponent only once. However, every student had to spar at least twice, ensuring that their skills were put to the test under different conditions. From the second floor, the professors observed the students, analyzing their performances with sharp, discerning eyes. The sparring matches themselves took place on the first floor, where the arena was set up. The first name was called, marking the beginning of the session. Henneth was the first to step forward, her confidence unwavering as she walked into the ring with a self-assured smirk. She boldly declared that there was no one who could compare to a true genius like herself. Rudd watched intently from the sidelines, already analyzing the situation. Henneth was undoubtedly talented, but he knew her greatest weakness: close-range combat. As a magician, her strength lay in her spellcasting, yet she had chosen a sword fighter as her opponent. He could already predict how the match would unfold. This would either serve as a painful lesson for her or an opportunity for her to adapt. Either way, it would be a battle worth watching. The sparring session had only just begun, and already, Rude Donatos could sense the undercurrents of competition beginning to take shape. As the sparring match began, Henneth wasted no time showcasing her magic. Flames crackled to life as she cast a fireball, launching it toward her opponent. The swordsman braced himself, raising his shield to block the incoming attack. He exhaled in relief when he realized that the spell wasn't as fast as he had expected, giving him time to counter. However, before he could react, Henneth was already moving. Her agility was on full display as she dashed forward, her hands glowing with ember-like energy. A barrage of flame arrows shot toward her opponent, forcing him further onto the defensive. Expecting her to maintain her distance and rely on magic, the swordsman let his guard down, confident that a magician like her would never willingly engage in close combat. He advanced, preparing to close the distance. But the moment he stepped forward, his expression twisted in shock. Henneth had already reached him. In the blink of an eye, she had abandoned her spellcasting and drawn a dagger, pressing the blade against his neck. His breath caught. She had baited him into lowering his defenses, using his assumptions against him. Caught off guard by her reckless and unpredictable fighting style, the swordsman had no choice but to concede defeat. The match ended with Henneth's victory declared, the crowd of students murmuring in surprise. The suddenness of her win and the sheer confidence she displayed left an impression on everyone watching. Even Rihanna, the esteemed leader of the Flames Guild, observed the match with quiet interest. As a master pyromancer, she could recognize talent when she saw it. With a nod of approval, she offered her compliments, acknowledging Henneth's potential. The praise made Henneth beam with pride, her usual arrogance now reinforced by validation from someone of such high standing. Rudd, watching from the sidelines, studied her closely. She had taken a bold risk, challenging a sword fighter despite being weakest in close-range combat. When he asked where she had come up with the idea, she responded with her usual confidence, claiming that she was simply thinking outside the box. But Ruth Donatos knew better. Her strategy, though impressive, was a double-edged sword. If her opponent had been more perceptive, if he had reacted a second faster, she would have been in serious danger. It wasn't logic that had guided her victory, it was instinct, and instinct alone wasn't always enough. Meanwhile, from their vantage point on the second floor, the professors continued their discussions. Professor Arthur, having seen Henneth's unique approach, remarked that the academy might need to bring in a specialized instructor, a pyromancer magician, to better support students like her. Professor Mason, though still focused on Rudd's earlier encounter with Ryan, gave a nod of agreement, acknowledging that while Henneth was strong, her magic could be refined even further under proper guidance. The next match was announced, and Vilm stepped forward, a smug grin on his face as he pointed directly at Rude. The crowd murmured in anticipation, knowing that Vilm's grudge against Rude Donatos had only deepened after their previous confrontation. Rudd, visibly irritated by the challenge, wasted no time dealing with him. From the very first exchange, it became clear that Vilm was completely outmatched. Rude Donatos overpowered him within moments, leaving no room for resistance. The match ended so decisively that Vilm was left begging for surrender. His body, battered and exhausted, could no longer continue, and the medics were called in to carry him off the stage on a stretcher. His defeat was so thorough that it left him incapacitated, a humiliating reminder of how outclassed he truly was. Not satisfied with how brief his match had been, Rude Donatos decided to take the opportunity to face his next opponent immediately. Without hesitation, he pointed at Balak, challenging him to a spar. The crowd stirred at the sudden decision. Everyone knew that Balak was a powerhouse, one of the strongest students in their class. Balak himself hesitated at first, reluctant to fight against a friend. He refused initially, stating that he had no desire to go up against Rude. But Rude Donatos was determined. He explained that Balak was the strongest among them and that he wanted to test himself against someone of true power. In his past life, he had seen Balak's strength firsthand, how his mere presence had been enough to shake the earth, how his punches had been powerful enough to collapse mountains. This was a battle Rude Donatos needed. Balak, after a moment of consideration, finally agreed. He acknowledged Rudd's strength, admitting that he had come to recognize how much his friend had grown. However, he made it clear that he wouldn't ask Rude Donatos to hold back, and if they were to fight, it had to be a real match. Rudd, resolute in his decision, replied that he wouldn't have it any other way. The Invigilator called for the duel to begin, and tension filled the air as the two combatants prepared for their clash. A memory from the past surfaced in Rudd's mind. He recalled practicing his swordsmanship with an intense focus, each movement sharp and refined. It was Balak who had approached him back then, telling him that Aesir Donatos had sent him because Rude Donatos was running wild and needed to calm down. But Rude, always stubborn, had refused to listen. He had dismissed Aesir's concerns with defiance, his pride clouding his judgment. Balak, not one to tolerate arrogance, had swiftly put him in his place, overpowering him with ease and delivering a painful lesson in humility. That moment had stayed with him, a reminder that raw talent alone wasn't enough. Strength came from discipline, from perseverance, from knowing one's limits and breaking through them. Back in the present, Rude Donatos pushed the memory aside and focused on the match before him. The sparring session had begun, and Balak wasted no time charging forward. His powerful dash sent shockwaves through the arena, the sheer force of his movement enough to intimidate most opponents. But Rude Donatos had expected this. As Balak closed in, he threw a devastating punch, but Rude Donatos reacted swiftly, countering with a precise strike to Balak's jaw. He followed up with a series of rapid attacks, testing Balak's defenses. But his friend barely flinched. Instead, Balak grabbed Rudd's shoulder with his iron grip, attempting to lock him down. Rudd, refusing to be restrained, immediately countered, attacking with his free hand. Balak dodged and attempted a feint, but Rude Donatos wasn't fooled. He quickly backed away, keeping a safe distance. For the first time in the match, Rude Donatos felt a surge of excitement. Even after landing several solid blows, Balak remained completely unfazed. His body, honed through years of training, was built for endurance. As a Steros warrior, his physique had been shaped by both intense bodybuilding and mana integration, making him incredibly resistant to damage. Rude Donatos understood now ordinary attacks wouldn't be enough to break through Balak's defenses. If he wanted to win, he would have to adapt. Adjusting his approach, Rude's strikes became faster and more unpredictable. He shifted his rhythm, making his attacks harder to read, forcing Balak to react instead of simply absorbing the damage. Every move he made was calculated, every step measured. The battle between them intensified, their blows clashing with increasing force. This was no longer just a spar, it was a test of will, a clash of strength and strategy. As the fight continued, Rod Donatos knew one thing for certain: this match would push him to his limits. And that was exactly what he needed. Balak remained steadfast, his confidence in his own physical defense unshaken. He had trained his entire life, sculpting his body into a living fortress, resistant to pain and nearly impervious to most attacks. But as the fight dragged on, something changed. Rod's blows, at first seemingly harmless, began to have an effect. Balak could feel the impact accumulating, a slow and steady erosion of his endurance. It wasn't brute force, it was something far more dangerous. Rod Donatos was deliberately striking the subtle weaknesses in his defense, places where the pressure built over time, wearing him down from the inside out. Realizing this, Balak narrowed his eyes, reassessing Rod's movements. He wasn't just throwing wild punches. There was a calculated rhythm to his strikes, a precision that mimicked a technique Balak knew all too well. The realization hit him like a shockwave. Rod Donatos was using the stero-style punch, a technique passed down through Balak's own family. It was a method of fighting as unyielding as a mountain range and as fluid as the sea, an unstoppable force that could break through even the toughest defenses when used with the right timing and control. The fact that Rod, someone outside of the Steros bloodline, had mastered such a technique was both astonishing and infuriating. Balak, now fully riled up, pushed himself to adjust, focusing entirely on Rod's attacks. As he continued exchanging blows, his body instinctively adapted, responding with the same style. The fight escalated into a fierce exchange, both of them locked in a test of skill rather than raw strength. Through each punch, Balak became more aware of something crucial. Rod's strength didn't come from sheer power. His greatest weapon was his unparalleled sense for combat, an instinct so refined that it allowed him to maneuver seamlessly through any opponent's strategy. It was almost unnatural, as if he had already fought this battle 100 times before. However, no matter how sharp his technique was, Rod's exhaustion was beginning to show. Balak, having spent years training his endurance, felt he had the upper hand in stamina. This was his chance. Deciding to end the fight in one final blow, he launched forward, putting every ounce of his remaining strength into a decisive strike. But just as his fist moved toward Rod, he saw something strange. Rod Donatos wasn't dodging. He wasn't even attempting to counter. Instead, he simply looked at Balak with a calm expression. His body still, but his eyes filled with clarity. Rod spoke, acknowledging that it had been a great match before bringing out his sword in one smooth motion. His movement was so fluid, so sudden, that Balak barely had time to react. The next thing he knew, a slash cut through the air, stopping just before it made fatal contact. The impact sent him stumbling backward, and he found himself falling onto the ground, landing on his back with a stunned expression. A thin sword mark tore through his shirt, a shallow wound just barely bleeding across his chest. The fight was over. Silence hung in the air before a sudden eruption of applause broke through the tension. The gathered students, having just witnessed an incredible display of skill and determination, clapped in appreciation. Even those who had doubted Rod's ability now saw him in a different light. It wasn't just that he had defeated Balak, he had done so with sheer technique, proving that he wasn't just another overconfident student but a true warrior. From the second-floor balcony, the professors looked on, their expressions a mixture of surprise and intrigue. Arthur and Mason, two of the more skeptical instructors, exchanged glances, acknowledging the sheer level of combat prowess displayed by both Rod Donatos and Balak. What struck them most was that neither of them had used magic during the fight. They had fought like professional dragon slayers, relying purely on martial skill. Even more shocking was the knowledge that Rod Donatos hadn't even fought with his full strength. Professor Donnell, watching the match intently, noticed something odd about Rod's technique. It was refined, too refined for a student who had only just begun training at the academy. There was something familiar about the way Rod Donatos moved, the precision in his swordplay, the way his body adjusted mid-fight. It reminded him of someone. A memory resurfaced: his own teacher, Bryce the Heavenly Sword. The similarity was undeniable, and yet, there was no way a student of Rod's background could have learned such techniques so soon. The realization sent a ripple of curiosity through the faculty. With the sparring matches concluded, the academy's daily routine resumed. Later that evening, the students gathered in the cafeteria for their meal, the excitement of the day's events still lingering in the air. Rod Donatos sat with Balak and Henneth, quietly eating his lunch while reflecting on the fight. However, as he glanced at his companions, he realized something amusing: he was the only poor student among them. Henneth came from an esteemed family of magicians, and Balak's lineage was well known for producing powerful warriors. Compared to them, he was an outsider, a mercenary son with no name worth remembering. The irony wasn't lost on him. As they ate, two figures entered the cafeteria, their presence immediately drawing attention. Two guild leaders from Tracker and Twilight Moon approached Rudd's table, their eyes fixed on him. He recognized them instantly, memories from his past life flashing through his mind. Both of them had died in the war against the Seven Dragons, perishing before they could fulfill their true potential. Their deaths had been losses to the world, but in this life, things had changed. Rodri, the leader of Tracker, was the first to speak, mentioning that his friend Abel had spoken highly of Rudd Donatos and that they needed someone like him in their guild. Abel, the leader of Twilight Moon, elaborated further, explaining that while his guild was ranked second, it was only because they took on jobs outside of combat, specializing in intelligence gathering. However, he made it clear that this didn't mean they were inferior to the top-ranked guild, Holy Flames. He then presented Rudd Donatos with a direct offer and invitation to join Twilight Moon as soon as he graduated. Rudd, considering the offer, knew it was tempting. Twilight Moon was a powerful guild, and with their support, he would have access to resources and connections that would aid him in his goals. However, he also knew the dangers of being tied down too early. He had no intention of letting himself be controlled by a single organization, not when he had other plans. Instead of outright refusal, Rudd Donatos countered with a proposal of his own. He asked them to find his older brother, a survivor of the ever-changing incident from 10 years ago. Abel, intrigued by the request, considered the trade-off and asked what he would gain in return. Rudd's response was simple: he would have a personal link to him. After a brief moment of deliberation, Abel agreed, accepting the deal before taking his leave with Rodri. As the guild leaders walked away, Henneth turned to Rudd, her expression one of curiosity. She remarked on his confidence, pointing out that very few people would have the courage to turn down such an offer. Then, with a smirk, she asked if he was happy with his decision. Before Rudd Donatos could answer, an envelope was placed on the table in front of them. The Academy had distributed their report cards from the first sparring session. He felt a flicker of curiosity. He had known his results in his past life, but this time things were different. Henneth, already glancing through hers, made a teasing remark, claiming that she had an idea of what his results would be. She assured him that whatever was written there, it would surely be something that would make his family proud. Rudd Donatos hesitated before opening the envelope, feeling, for the first time in this new life, an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Rudd sat in silence for a moment, staring at the evaluation form in front of him without turning it over. Henneth and Balak had already read theirs, both receiving glowing remarks on their combat prowess during the sparring session. There had been no surprises there. Both of them were exceptionally skilled, and their evaluations reflected that. But when it came to his own, something held him back. A strange weight settled in his chest, an irrational hesitation. Perhaps it was because, in his past life, he had never once been recognized in such a way. His failures had far outweighed his victories. His efforts had always been overshadowed by those stronger than him, by Aesir Donatos, by his comrades, by those who had been born with an innate talent that he had always lacked. And now, standing at the precipice of something new, he found himself hesitating. Henneth, never one to wait for permission, snatched his report from his hands and checked it herself. What she saw caused her eyes to widen slightly before she turned to him with an expression of surprise. Instead of a written evaluation full of notes on his performance, his report bore something far more significant: the signatures of all the professors who had been present at the sparring session. It wasn't just one or two. Every professor had personally endorsed his report, an incredibly rare occurrence that signified his potential in multiple fields of combat. Still processing the weight of what that meant, Rudd Donatos made his way toward the faculty office, where he found the professors already waiting for him. Unlike the formal meetings he had expected, the atmosphere was surprisingly warm, each professor greeting him with a distinct show of enthusiasm, each one subtly trying to outdo the others in friendliness. All except for Damon, who remained his usual reserved self, offering nothing more than a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Rudd wasted no time in getting to the point. He asked if he had been summoned to discuss his choice for a personal advisor, and the professors confirmed that this was indeed the purpose of the meeting. It was a tradition at the academy that, after the first major sparring session, students were separated into different advanced training classes with assigned advisors based on their aptitude. Usually, a professor would leave a signature on a student's evaluation form if they were interested in mentoring them. However, as Damon pointed out, it was exceedingly rare for all the professors to leave their signatures for a single student. This alone proved that Rudd Donatos had demonstrated potential across multiple disciplines, making him an anomaly in the Academy's history. Now, the choice rested with him. He was free to decide which professor he wanted as his personal advisor. Rudd, after careful consideration, chose Professor Donnell. He stated plainly that he wished to learn sword fighting from him, but under one specific condition: he wanted Donnell to take him as his personal apprentice, not just as an ordinary student. His request caused a moment of silence among the professors. Donnell, intrigued yet puzzled by the suggestion, asked why he was making such a bold request. Rudd's response was direct. He explained that the successor to the heavenly spearmanship had yet to be chosen. This was a unique blend of mana, magic, and sword fighting developed specifically for battling the most fearsome dragons, Tarragons. Unlike ordinary swordsmanship, it was a technique that could only be inherited by one person at a time. In his past life, the one who had been chosen as the successor had been his own brother, heir. Denel, having once been a student of the legendary heavenly sword, had been one of the few who had trained alongside Aesir Donatos, and as a result, he had first-hand knowledge of the techniques Rude Donatos sought to master. Denel's expression shifted at Rude's words. The request was not a light one. It was a direct challenge to the long-standing tradition of inheritance. For years, no successor had been named, and now Rude Donatos was standing before him, claiming that he was worthy of such a path. When Denel pressed him further, asking why he wanted to pursue this legacy, Rude Donatos did not hesitate in his answer. He stated that he needed power. He recounted, in plain and unwavering words, how he had lost his friends and family to a dragon because of his own weakness. He believed, with absolute certainty, that if he had been strong enough, he could have saved them. He could have prevented the tragedies that had unfolded before his eyes, but he hadn't. And now, given a second chance, he would not allow himself to remain weak. He would gain the strength to protect those he cared about. He would never let himself be powerless again. Denel listened carefully, his mind drifting to memories of his own past. He had once lost his sister to a dragon attack, a wound that had never truly healed. He understood all too well the pain Rude Donatos spoke of, the deep-seated desire to prevent such suffering from happening again. However, he also knew that power rooted in vengeance was a dangerous path. If Rude Donatos sought strength only to exact revenge, then he would never be worthy of inheriting the heavenly spearmanship. That was the truth of the art. It was meant not for destruction, but for salvation. But as he observed Rudd, as he weighed his words, he saw something beyond just revenge. He saw the drive to protect, and that changed everything. After a long silence, Denel made his decision. He accepted Rude Donatos as his personal apprentice. However, he then proposed something unexpected. Instead of Rude Donatos simply training under him, Denel suggested that all the professors should serve as Rude's personal advisors. He emphasized that Rude Donatos had displayed talent in multiple fields, and restricting him solely to sword fighting would be a mistake. If there was a way to develop all of his abilities to their fullest potential, then it was something worth exploring. Rudd was momentarily stunned by the suggestion. The idea of having multiple personal advisors was unheard of. Students were assigned to a single professor specializing in one discipline. If he accepted this arrangement, it would set a precedent unlike anything the academy had seen before. He voiced his concerns, pointing out that such favoritism could cause resentment among the other students. It would make him a target for criticism, and many would see it as unfair. Professor Arthur, however, immediately seconded the idea, arguing that exceptional dragon slayers were needed more than ever. If investing in Rudd's growth could lead to a future where he played a key role in eliminating the dragon threat, then it was a necessary risk. The other professors, after a moment of consideration, also agreed. Each of them recognized that Rudd's existence in this timeline was not ordinary. Whether they fully understood his past or not, they could see that his growth was accelerating at an unnatural rate. If nurturing that potential meant breaking a few traditions, then so be it. Denel clarified that this was merely a suggestion, and ultimately, the choice was Rudd's to make. Whatever decision he reached, they would respect it. Rude Donatos sat in silence, reflecting on the offer. If he accepted, it would mean pushing himself harder than ever before. It would mean carrying expectations greater than he had ever known. And yet, a small voice in his mind whispered a warning. Was he taking away an opportunity from someone else? By monopolizing all of the professor's guidance, was he depriving another student of a chance to grow? He had once been that student, overlooked and cast aside while others flourished. Would he now be doing the same to someone else? And yet, as he weighed the pros and cons as he considered the path ahead, he knew one truth above all else. The future was no longer the same, and if he wanted to make sure that this time things ended differently, then he would need every advantage he could get. Rudd felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was well aware of the consequences this choice could bring, the path it would set him on, and the expectations that would follow. If he accepted the offer to be trained under multiple professors, he would place himself in a position of great scrutiny, drawing attention not only from his peers but from the world beyond the academy. Others would see him as favored, privileged in a way that no other student had been before. It could make him a target, a name whispered in admiration or resentment, depending on who was speaking. But as much as those concerns lingered, he knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. The future he had seen, the destruction that awaited them all, would not be changed by inaction. If he wanted to prevent the same tragedies from unfolding, if he wanted to save everyone this time, he had no choice but to embrace the responsibility his brother once bore. Steeling his resolve, he made his decision. He would accept. He would push himself beyond the limitations he once held in his past life. If he truly wished to become the dragon slayer the world needed, then this was the first step. With quiet determination, he voiced his agreement, sealing his path forward. The professors nodded in approval, each of them understanding the weight of his choice, though some looked more intrigued than others. Arthur, who had been the first to support the idea, gave an approving smirk, while Danelle simply observed him, his expression unreadable. From this moment on, Rodinatos was no longer just another student at the academy. He had become a name worth watching. Elsewhere, in a different part of the academy, Leon Creer was staggering out of an independent sparring session, barely able to keep herself steady. It had been grueling 2 hours of relentless drills on the faculty training grounds, and not by choice. The session had been assigned to her as punishment for hitting Rodinatos earlier in the day, and she had nearly become a living punching bag for the instructor overseeing her disciplinary training. Every muscle in her body ached, her movements stiff as she tried to walk properly. To make matters worse, her punishment wasn't over. She had also been saddled with cleaning duty and additional makeup classes, as if the training itself hadn't been enough. Her mind was clouded with frustration, her thoughts circling back to one thing: Rudd. She was convinced that he had gone to the professors about their little skirmish, that he had been the one to report her over something as minor as a brief fight. The idea of him complaining to authority over such a trivial matter only fueled her resentment, and now she was suffering the consequences. To top it all off, her mother had scolded her as well, adding to her humiliation. The entire day had turned into a disaster, and it was all because of him. Unbeknownst to her, Rodinatos had been quietly observing from a distance. He had never expected to see Leon Creer in such a vulnerable state. The Leon Creer he had known in his past life had been cold and sharp, almost mechanical in her precision and focus. He had even questioned whether she was truly human at times, given how emotionless she had seemed. But that had only been after her mother's death. Before that, she had been just another girl, an ordinary student with no particular animosity toward him. They hadn't been on good terms back then, so he hadn't paid her much attention. But now, seeing her like this, angry, hurting, and on the verge of tears, he felt a pang of guilt. Even though he knew he hadn't been the one to report her, it was clear that his presence in this timeline had somehow changed things for her. Unsure of what to do, but unable to simply walk away, Rodinatos finally approached her. He asked why she was crying, his tone more hesitant than usual. Ryan, caught off guard by his presence, immediately snapped at him in frustration. Her emotions boiled over, and she accused him of being a coward, claiming that he had gone to the professors because he couldn't handle a simple fight. She made it sound as if he had run off to tattle on her the moment things hadn't gone his way. Her words were harsh, but Rodinatos remained composed, immediately apologizing instead of arguing. The action stunned her. She had expected him to get defensive, to protest or try to deny it. Instead, he simply handed her his handkerchief, his voice calm as he admitted that he had never reported her at all. In fact, he confessed that he was just as embarrassed by the rumors spreading about him. He explained that one of his friends had been the one to speak with the professors about the incident, completely unaware of the consequences it would bring upon her. Ryan, listening to his explanation, slowly processed what he was saying. She realized to her annoyance that she had been mistaken from the very start. The punishment she had suffered had not been his doing, and her anger had been misdirected. She sighed in frustration, reluctantly accepting his apology. Though she still resented the situation, she no longer blamed him for it. However, she wasn't about to let him off easily. With a warning, she told him that if he ever got her into trouble again, she wouldn't hesitate to make him pay for it. Rudd, smirking slightly, reassured her that he would do his best to avoid causing her any more problems. In reality, he knew that she would grow into a formidable warrior regardless of his involvement. But if his presence in this timeline had changed her path, then he would make sure it wasn't for the worse. What surprised him, however, was the way Rion's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. She mumbled something under her breath, something shy, almost hesitant, before hastily walking away. It took him a second to realize what she had said. She had told him that he could greet her when they saw each other from now on. It was an oddly soft remark, one that he hadn't expected from someone as sharp and unyielding as Leon Creer. Left momentarily bewildered, he shook his head and continued on his way, only to realize that they were heading in the same direction toward Professor Danel's office. This startled him. In his past life, Leon Creer had studied under Professor Mason. Given her natural talent for sword fighting, Mason had been the obvious choice to help refine her skills and strengthen her weaknesses in close-range combat. But now, something had changed. She had chosen Danelle instead. Noticing the confusion on Rudd's face, Leon Creer raised an eyebrow and asked him what was wrong. He hesitated before explaining that it would have made more sense for her to study under Professor Mason, given her fighting style. To his surprise, Leon Creer revealed that she had never received a message from Professor Mason. Even if she had, she admitted that she wouldn't have chosen him. Her. Reasoning was simple. He was the one in charge of her makeup classes, which so far had consisted mostly of being used as a training dummy. The thought clearly annoyed her, and she made no effort to hide her resentment. Rudd felt another wave of guilt settle in. His presence in this timeline had caused yet another unexpected shift. In his past life, Ryan's training under Mason had helped shape her into the warrior she had become. Now, she was on a different path, one that might change her trajectory entirely. Whether that was a good or bad thing, he had yet to determine. As they arrived at Professor Danel's office, the class on sword fighting began. Danel wasted no time in assessing them, his keen gaze scanning over both Rudd Donatos and Ryan. He stated plainly that neither of them needed basic practice anymore. What they required now was independent sparring. In other words, they were going to spend their training sessions getting beaten up while refining their skills. It was an unorthodox method, but Rudd Donatos understood the reasoning behind it. This was only the beginning. His path had already diverged from what he had known in his past life, and now the people around him were changing as well. If he wanted to control his fate, he would have to be ready for anything. And for now, that meant stepping into the ring once more. Her irritation mounted as more time passed. Had he forgotten entirely? Was she standing here like an idiot waiting for someone who had never intended to keep his word? The thought only fueled her growing annoyance. She clenched her fists, debating whether she should just leave, when finally she heard the hurried sound of footsteps approaching. She turned just in time to see Rudd Donatos appear, slightly out of breath from rushing. The sight of him did nothing to ease her irritation. If anything, the knowledge that he had made her wait only made her angrier. But something else caught her attention, an unmistakable scent lingering on him. It was faint, but the rich aroma of food still clung to his clothes. Her eyes narrowed in realization. He had gone out to eat. The realization sent a sharp spike of annoyance through her. So, while she had been standing here, waiting in the cold, he had been off somewhere, indulging himself in a nice meal? It was almost insulting. Her fingers curled into her palms, her irritation shifting into something sharper, more personal. She hadn't even expected much from him, but somehow he had still managed to disappoint her. Rudd, on the other hand, seemed to sense the shift in her mood. His usual composed demeanor wavered slightly as he stood before her, clearly aware that he had messed up. But instead of making excuses or trying to smooth things over, he simply stood there, waiting for her judgment. For some reason, that only irritated her more. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to push the emotion down. It didn't matter. It wasn't like she had been looking forward to this. And yet, there was an odd weight in her chest that refused to go away. This was why she avoided people. This was why she didn't let herself rely on anyone. Still, she wasn't the type to dwell on pointless emotions. Instead, she straightened her posture, forcing herself to push past the irritation, and simply reminded herself of why she had agreed to this training in the first place. If she let something this trivial get to her, then she was no better than the people who let their feelings cloud their judgment in battle. That was not who she was. Without another word, she gestured toward the training area, making it clear that whatever had happened earlier didn't matter. What mattered now was the fight. If he was truly serious about teaching her, then he had better prove it. Rudd, relieved that she wasn't about to walk away entirely, immediately adjusted his stance. The tension from earlier faded slightly, but in the back of his mind, he knew one thing for certain: he would not be making her wait again. As Rudd Donatos walked through the dimly lit corridors of the academy, his mind was still reeling from his experience with the heavenly spearmanship's mana engraving. Mana, the unrefined energy of life, had always been known to be stored within the heart, acting as the core of all magic. However, heavenly spearmanship defied this convention. Instead of relying on internal reserves, it used a technique known as mana engraving, allowing the successor to absorb and channel external mana through a vast subspace called the heavenly domain. This meant that the heart no longer functioned as a storage container, but rather as a conduit, a pathway that determined how efficiently one could draw from this boundless energy. The advantages of this technique were extraordinary. Unlike traditional warriors and magicians who were limited by their internal mana capacity, a successor of the heavenly spearmanship had access to an external, nearly infinite reservoir of power. However, there was a catch: if one had previously trained using the heart as a storage space, shifting its function to that of a mere pathway would weaken its efficiency. It would take time and rigorous training to fully adapt to this method and draw upon the heavenly domain at will. As Rudd Donatos sat in front of Professor Danel, the realization of what he was about to undertake fully sank in. This was not just a step toward mastering swordsmanship. It was a rebirth of power, a transformation that would redefine his entire approach to combat. Professor Danel, ever the composed mentor, carefully studied Rudd Donatos before asking if he had ever trained in application magic before. The question made Rudd Donatos pause. In his past life, the only application magic he had trained in was continuous platform, a technique based on a magician's mana levels. It allowed for seamless movement and improved spellcasting, but it was entirely different from the methodology of heavenly spearmanship. He answered honestly, admitting he had not trained in anything beyond that. With that, Danelle instructed him to take a seat and began the mana engraving process. The moment the process started, Rude Donatos felt a surge of raw, unfiltered mana coursing through him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. His consciousness was suddenly ripped from the physical world and thrown into a vast, boundless space and endless sky stretching infinitely in every direction. This was the heavenly domain, the inheritance of generations of past successors, a repository of their knowledge, memories, and strength. He stood there, suspended in the vastness of this ethereal world, feeling the weight of countless warriors who had come before him. As he took it all in, a voice echoed through the endless sky. It was familiar yet distant, as if calling from the depths of time itself. He tried to focus, to pinpoint its source, but before he could process it fully, his consciousness was abruptly pulled back into reality. His eyes snapped open, and he found himself once again seated in the training grounds, facing Professor Danelle. Danelle studied him closely, clearly expecting a reaction. When Rude Donatos hesitated, struggling to put his experience into words, the professor's sharp gaze shifted slightly, as if searching for something within him. However, what truly shocked Danelle was what came next. Rude Donatos had already begun drawing mana from the heavenly domain. This was an impossibility. For most successors, it took weeks, sometimes months, to attune themselves to the domain and establish even the smallest link. Yet, here Rude Donatos was, already channeling its energy. The professor could hardly believe his eyes. But Rude Donatos himself knew the reason why his past life's training in continuous platform had already conditioned his body to operate with external mana flow. Now that his heart functioned purely as a conduit, the transition had been nearly seamless. However, what mattered most was the engraving on his hand. The true extent of a person's heavenly spearmanship capability was measured by the number of wings displayed on their mana engraving. Professor Danelle himself bore 6 wings, while the legendary Ein Bryce had 7, the same number as Aesir Donatos, Rude's brother. But when Rude Donatos glanced down at his own engraving, he saw that he had just 1 wing. The implications of this weighed on him. According to what Donald had told him earlier, once the engraving was completed, it became permanently attached to the soul, remaining within the heavenly domain even after death. This meant that every past successor still existed within that subspace, in some form their power, their knowledge, and even fragments of their consciousness. When Rude Donatos had entered the heavenly domain, he had felt the presence of Danelle and Ein Bryce. However, Aesir's presence was missing. This troubled him deeply. He had assumed that even if Aesir Donatos existed in another timeline, his consciousness should have still been connected to the domain. But it wasn't. Did this mean that his brother had never completed the engraving in this timeline? Or worse, had he been erased from the cycle of succession altogether? The absence of Aesir's presence left him with more questions than answers. Soon after, Rude Donatos made his way toward the library, where Henneth and Balak were already waiting for him. The 3 of them walked through the academy's bustling corridors, weaving through students who were finishing their daily routines. Henneth, ever curious, turned to Rude Donatos and asked about his class with the personal advisors. Rude, unwilling to delve into the complexity of his training, kept his response simple. He stated that it was nothing special, mentioning that Professor Mason and Arthur had simply given him a few compliments. Henneth, however, wasn't convinced. She immediately pointed out that there was no way this was normal. A huge exception had been made for him. After all 4 professors had become his personal advisors, something unheard of in the Academy's history. She then shifted the topic to Professor Damon, the most enigmatic of them all, wondering aloud if he had ever removed his signature mask. Rudd thought back to his one and only meeting with Damon in the professor's office. It had been a strange encounter, one filled with long stretches of silence, punctuated only by the faint sound of tea being poured. Throughout their meeting, Damon had barely spoken, leaving Rude Donatos to sit awkwardly as the time dragged on. The only real exchange they had shared was about the tea itself. Damon had asked if Rude Donatos liked it, to which Rude Donatos had replied that it had a pleasant aroma. Damon had then offered an unexpected response, stating that it was one of the most popular teas in the Empire, and that he too enjoyed it. But what struck Rude Donatos as odd was that Damon had never actually taken a sip during the entire conversation. After that, they had simply sat there for another 30 minutes in absolute silence. The memory left Rude Donatos with an unsettling feeling. Damon was a complete mystery. And what was worse, in his past life, Damon had been the first professor to die. As they reached the entrance of the library, Rude Donatos shifted the conversation, asking Henneth and Balak about their own classes. Balak, with his usual enthusiasm, stated that he liked Professor Mason, largely because she seemed to appreciate the beauty of physique, something he valued deeply. His admiration for physical strength made him an obvious fit for Mason's rigorous training. Henneth, on the other hand, revealed something unexpected. She didn't have a personal advisor for magic. Instead, she had been assigned a random lecturer. What made it worse was that this particular professor had outright told her that pyromancy was the least effective type of magic. Henneth's expression darkened slightly as she recounted the words, but there was something deeper behind her irritation, something resembling doubt. It was subtle, but Donatos caught it. He knew that Henneth took pride in her abilities, and to hear someone dismiss them outright was something she wouldn't take lightly. However, instead of outwardly expressing her frustration, she simply carried on, her demeanor as confident as ever. Rudd said nothing, but he filed the information away. The future was already shifting, and it seemed that everyone's path, his, Ryan's, Henneth's, was beginning to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. Henneth's anger flared visibly as she expressed her strong disagreement with the suggestion to switch to another type of magic. The mere thought of abandoning pyromancy, something she had honed with relentless dedication, was utterly unacceptable to her. Her frustration was evident, her fists clenched at her sides as she resisted the notion. Balak, attempting to diffuse the tension, pointed out that there weren't many pyromancer combat magicians, which only served to irritate her further. She redirected her frustration toward him, her voice sharp as she rebutted his claim, unwilling to entertain the idea that her chosen path was in any way a disadvantage. Rudd, recognizing the need to intervene before the situation escalated further, stepped in. He calmly asked if she could simply switch classes to a more suitable course. However, Henneth, still fuming, explained that the issue wasn't that simple. There were no dedicated pyromancer lecturers in Iradium, meaning she had been placed in a general magic class with no proper guidance for her specific abilities. The realization irritated Rudd Donatos as well. Pyromancy was far from a weak form of magic. If anything, it was one of the most destructive types. The fact that the academy didn't even have a specialized instructor for it was ridiculous. As they continued discussing, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jeremy Duville. The moment Rudd Donatos spotted him, his mood immediately darkened. There were very few people who genuinely irritated him, and Jeremy was one of them. With his ever-present smirk and self-assured demeanor, he approached them effortlessly, greeting Henneth and Balak with ease. Unlike them, however, Rudd Donatos was far less welcoming. His expression hardened, and without any pretense of pleasantries, he immediately confronted Jeremy, bluntly asking if he had conducted a background check on them. Jeremy, completely unfazed by Rudd's hostility, only chuckled. His confidence was unwavering, and rather than denying anything, he casually remarked on how extraordinary Rudd Donatos must be for all 4 professors to offer to teach him. There was an edge of amusement in his tone, as if he were studying Rudd Donatos like a rare specimen. He had always been like this, possessing an uncanny ability to analyze and break people down with nothing more than observation. It was a trait that had once earned him the nickname the Determiner among the Dragon Slayers. But Rudd Donatos knew Jeremy far too well. He knew the truth behind the facade. While Jeremy wasn't necessarily a bad person, he was selfish and arrogant, always believing he knew what was best for everyone around him. He had a habit of making decisions on behalf of others, manipulating events to align with his own views, often without considering the consequences. And in Rudd's past life, those consequences had been deadly. Jeremy, still wearing that knowing smirk, extended an invitation for Rudd Donatos to join the student council. His words were calculated, his tone friendly yet slightly condescending, as if he had already anticipated Rudd's answer. And Rudd, without hesitation, refused outright. There was no need for him to even consider it. He had no interest in being involved with Jeremy in any way. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that Jeremy hadn't changed in the slightest. Even now, he still acted as if he knew everything, still played the role of a leader, when in reality, he was a man who made decisions that led to countless deaths. Henneth, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, nervously apologized for Rudd's behavior. Jeremy, however, remained unbothered. As he turned to leave, he casually slipped something into one of the books on the table before walking away, throwing an offhand remark about not wanting to interrupt their study session. Rudd Donatos returned shortly after, and Henneth, noticing the way he was glaring at the retreating figure of Jeremy, couldn't help but ask why he was being so harsh toward him. Rudd Donatos didn't hesitate in his response, bluntly stating that Jeremy wasn't acting like a friend. To his mild surprise, Balak agreed. Later, as Rudd Donatos sat alone, he retrieved the book that Jeremy had left behind and flipped through it. Tucked between the pages was a note. The message was brief, but carried an ominous weight. "Beware of Damon." Rudd stared at the words, then scoffed quietly to himself. He knew Jeremy too well to take this warning seriously. Jeremy was the one to be wary of, not Professor Damon. In his past life, Damon had been the first professor to die, but his death had not been by accident. It had been a result of the immense pressure placed upon him by Jeremy himself. While Jeremy hadn't killed Damon directly, his actions had backed him into a corner, making him feel like a threat to the Empire, which had ultimately led to his tragic suicide. Damon's death had sent shockwaves through the academy and beyond, creating a series of pivotal consequences that had contributed to the chaos that followed. Rude Donatos knew that he couldn't allow history to repeat itself. This time, he would prevent it. He would save Damon. As Rude Donatos and Leon Creer made their way through the capital, his mind remained weighed down by thoughts of the past. The bustling streets, filled with vendors, performers, and travelers, were lively, but his focus was elsewhere. His mind drifted back to Damon, to the choices Jeremy had made in his past life, to the countless lives that had been lost as a result. He knew that time was limited. He couldn't afford to waste any of it. Ryan's voice suddenly snapped him back to reality. She was nagging at him, grumbling about how he had arrived not even 10 minutes early. The irritation in her voice was clear, but there was also a strange sense of familiarity in the way she spoke. She had become comfortable enough to scold him so easily, something that hadn't existed between them in his past life. Their arrival in the heart of the capital was met with Ryan's obvious excitement. She took in the lively atmosphere with bright eyes, far more animated than usual. For once, she wasn't acting as the untouchable swordswoman. Instead, she was simply a girl experiencing the capital for the first time. Her enthusiasm caught Rude Donatos off guard, and when she eagerly asked where they were headed, he realized that he had no plan. Figuring they could just buy some supplies, he let her lead the way. Ryan, without hesitation, grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a clothing store. Before he knew it, she was trying on a white dress, holding it up for his opinion. His response was brief and unhelpful, but she bought it anyway. To his surprise, she then insisted on buying something for him as well. He initially refused, but she was persistent, eventually directing him toward an attendant who handed him a shirt to try on. As he stepped out in the new clothes, Leon Creer watched him closely. She found herself reflecting on how strange Rude Donatos was. When they had first met, he had picked a fight with her. Yet the moment he had seen her cry, he had apologized sincerely. She had never met someone like him before, someone who could switch between arrogance and kindness so effortlessly. But what unsettled her was the way he looked at her. Every time their eyes met, it felt as if he was seeing someone else, not her, but a shadow of a person he had known before. As they left the store, Leon Creer glanced at him again. Noting that the new shirt suited him well, she teasingly questioned why he had paid for lunch despite the fact that she had insisted on buying the shirt for him. Rudd, keeping his response brief, simply explained that he had to. Their conversation shifted when Ryan, curiosity getting the best of her, asked about Rudd's past as a mercenary. She wondered if he had ever fought alongside comrades, people who were like family to him. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, she asked if he had ever experienced his first love. The question startled him. Without thinking, he snapped, yelling that those people were more skilled at stabbing others in the back than at forming relationships. There had never been time for love, not in a world where betrayal was a constant shadow. Rudd's frustration deepened as Leon Creer continued to tease him, her relentless prodding pushing him closer to his limit. He had no interest in discussing his past, let alone his experiences with love, and her insistence on needling him only made matters worse. He had already revealed more about himself than he was comfortable with, and now she was pressing further, venturing into territory he had no desire to explore. Each sharp remark she threw at him chipped away at his patience until he finally decided he had had enough. He turned away, fully intending to leave, but before he could take a single step, Leon Creer abruptly declared that they couldn't leave yet. Her sudden change in demeanor caught him off guard. She wasn't teasing anymore. Instead, there was a determined look in her eyes, one that told him she had already decided on something. Without waiting for his response, she revealed that she had changed their plans. The casual shopping trip he had expected was no longer happening. Instead, she was taking him to meet her family, the Dragon Slayers. The realization sent a jolt through Rudd. He froze, unable to immediately process what she had just said. The Dragon Slayer headquarters was one of the most important institutions in the world, home to some of the strongest warriors known to mankind. In his past life, he had never even set foot there, let alone been invited. But more than that, he knew what the future held for that place. Without giving him a chance to argue, Leon Creer dragged him toward the warp gate. Before he knew it, they were enveloped in a surge of energy, transported across vast distances in the blink of an eye. When the light faded, they arrived in Saren, the capital of the Level Kingdom, located in the west. Saren was a city full of life and energy, smaller than the main capital but no less bustling. It was a place filled with warriors, merchants, and scholars alike, all drawn to its unique history and strategic significance. However, according to Rudd's memories, Saren was destined for ruin. In just a few short years, the 7 dragons would attack, their fury reducing the city to little more than a wasteland. That devastating event would mark the destruction of the Dragon Slayer headquarters, wiping it from existence. As they made their way to the Dragon Slayer headquarters, Rude Donatos couldn't shake the eerie sense of foreboding. He was walking through a place that, in his past life, had already been erased. The buildings, the people, the liveliness, it would all be gone. And yet, here he was, witnessing it all as if fate had never touched it. Their arrival at the headquarters was met with an unexpected reception. The first person they encountered was Harold, the gardener, a man with a kind, weathered face who seemed genuinely thrilled to see Leon Creer bringing someone new. The moment his eyes landed on Rudd, his excitement became overwhelming, and he immediately declared that this was a cause for celebration. He spoke of parties, banners, and feasts, as if Leon Creer bringing home a friend was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Ryan, clearly embarrassed, scolded Harold, but her reaction only made Rudd Donato smirk at her discomfort. The sight of Ryan, flustered and defensive, was something he had never thought he would see. Meanwhile, he reflected on how strange this situation was. In his past life, he had never truly had friends. He had always been alone, fighting his battles in isolation, never welcomed anywhere like this. And yet, here he was not just being accepted, but being celebrated. As they entered the headquarters, the reaction from the Dragon Slayers was even more intense. The moment they stepped inside, dozens of warriors turned to stare, their faces filled with shock and intrigue. Leon Creer had never brought anyone home before. To them, this was an extraordinary event, and before Rudd Donatos could even process what was happening, they swarmed him, their excitement palpable. They surrounded him with curiosity, bombarding him with questions, making it impossible for him to respond. Ryan, her embarrassment reaching its peak, shoved them away, trying to restore order. Rudd Donatos watched it all unfold with an odd mix of amusement and unease. For the first time, he saw the Dragon Slayers not as warriors, but as a family. They were genuine, loud, chaotic, but most of all, deeply connected. He had always thought of the Dragon Slayers as an elite, battle-hardened group, a force feared across the continent. But seeing them now, laughing and joking, he began to understand why Leon Creer had changed so drastically after Saren fell. This warmth, this closeness, it had been her foundation. And when it was all destroyed, so was she. Ryan led him to the drawing room, where her mother, Adeline Krill, the captain of the Dragon Slayers, was waiting. The moment Adeline saw her daughter, her face lit up with excitement, but her joy quickly turned to suspicion as she questioned why Leon Creer wasn't at school. Her first assumption? Leon Creer had punched someone and gotten expelled. Her tone was playful yet expectant, as if this sort of behavior was entirely plausible. Ryan, clearly mortified, insisted that wasn't the case and explained that she had simply wanted to introduce a friend. The words shocked Adeline into silence. Her daughter had never had a friend outside the guild before. The revelation left her momentarily speechless, while another woman in the room, Rihanna, found the situation deeply amusing. With a knowing smirk, she pointed out the irony of Ryan, who had near zero social skills, somehow bringing home a friend. As the introductions commenced, Rudd Donatos maintained a proper and respectful demeanor, offering a formal introduction. His name, however, immediately caught Rihanna's attention. She recognized him instantly, recalling his performance during the sparring sessions. She mentioned that he was one of the students worth watching, clearly having taken note of his skills. Her attention then shifted to Henneth, inquiring about her. To which Rudd Donatos explained that Henneth wasn't particularly fond of the magician lecturers she had been assigned. Rihanna, smiling slightly, reassured him that it wouldn't be a problem for much longer, hinting that Henneth would soon have the best teacher possible. Meanwhile, Adeline was still trying to process the fact that her daughter had actually brought a friend home. She was so overwhelmed that she thanked Rudd Donatos repeatedly, much to his discomfort. She then began explaining something deeply personal about Leon Creer, something that made Rudd Donatos see her in a new light. Ryan, she explained, was different from other children. Her sharp senses allowed her to perceive emotions with incredible accuracy, making her highly attuned to people's thoughts and feelings. However, this same trait made it difficult for her to respond appropriately in social situations. She had never been able to form friendships easily because, while she could understand people, she struggled to connect with them naturally. Then, Adeline learned something else. Rudd Donatos was the student whose wrist Leon Creer had broken. This revelation immediately prompted her to scold Ryan, much to Ryan's embarrassment. However, before the situation could escalate, Rudd Donatos stepped in, explaining that he had provoked her first and that it had simply been a fight between two combatants. Adeline, unconvinced, insisted that Leon Creer apologize properly, forcing Leon Creer into an awkward situation. Rudd, feeling increasingly embarrassed, tried to downplay it, but Adeline refused to let it go. Observing all of this, Rihanna couldn't help but comment. She remarked that Rudd Donatos was no ordinary student. She had been watching him closely and had noticed something others had missed: his effortless use of the Steros family technique. More than that, she even mentioned that Abel had wanted to scout him, a fact that took Adeline by surprise. Hearing this, Adeline took a moment to reevaluate Rudd, now seeing him not just as her daughter's friend, but as a warrior with immense potential. At that moment, Leon Creer spoke up again, adding that Rudd Donatos had been teaching her close-range martial arts. That single statement changed everything, heightening their ability to detect and respond to attacks in real time. It was an ability that only the most elite warriors could develop. a skill that demanded extreme control over one's body and mana flow. Seeing Rudd Donatos execute it so naturally sent a shiver down Adeline's spine. This was not something a 17-year-old academy student should be capable of. It was a technique honed by warriors who had fought against dragons for years.
Two spectators whispered nervously, watching as Rudd Donatos boldly stepped forward into the ominous battle ring. Weapons clattered onto the preparation table. Rudd calmly selected twin daggers, eyes unwavering despite the growing tension. High-ranking cadets observed quietly, curiosity mixing with disbelief. Nobody expected a freshman to confront the three-headed beast. Rudd dashed across the circular arena, narrowly evading deadly strikes, his movements faster than anyone anticipated possible. After his flawless victory, Rudd appeared confidently, smiling slightly. "These clothes suit you well," someone commented. The white-haired woman smiled confidently, her sharp gaze locking onto Rudd. "Ready for a real challenge?" she asked. Stretching his arms, Rudd replied casually, "I'm thankful. When else could I fight a ranked dragon slayer?" She chuckled softly, adjusting her gloves. "That's the spirit. Just don't die before showing something impressive today." She skipped toward the arena. Behind her, a worried student whispered nervously, "Mother, please take it easy." A sly observer grinned, eyes gleaming with amusement. "This should be interesting," he muttered, watching everything unfold carefully. The audience roared with excitement as Rudd and his opponent took positions inside the grand combat arena. The instructor raised his wooden sword. "Standard rules apply. No deadly strikes, only disarm and score hits. Additionally," he continued, smiling slyly, "if you land a clean hit on me, victory is yours immediately." Rudd nodded firmly, eyes unwavering. "Of course," he replied confidently, tightening his grip on the wooden sword. The instructor grinned wide, stance shifting aggressively. "Now then, Rudd, are you ready?" His aura turned intimidating. Rudd firmly gripped the wooden sword, muscles tensing, his stance dropped low, prepared for immediate counterattack. Confidently smirking, Rudd taunted his opponent. "You can come any time," his voice echoed clearly across the silent arena. The instructor's smile deepened, eyes narrowing slightly. Without hesitation, he leaned forward, signaling the beginning of his assault. In a single explosive movement, the instructor lunged forward. His steps barely touched the ground, moving swiftly. With unmatched precision, the instructor closed the distance instantly. His feet carved a sharp path across stone. The instructor attacked first, his strike fast and direct. Rudd blocked successfully, arms trembling under sudden pressure. Without pause, the instructor shifted weight, delivering a swift kick toward Rudd's exposed side with brutal precision. Rudd crossed his arms to defend, absorbing the impact. Pain shot through, but he stayed standing firm. Spinning rapidly, the instructor created distance again, his movements flawless. Rudd exhaled sharply, regaining his defensive posture immediately. With a fierce shout, the instructor lunged forward again, preparing another powerful attack aimed directly at Rudd's chest. Two stunned spectators watched in disbelief. Hey, am I seeing this right?" one asked nervously. High above, another cadet muttered, "That kid is taking on our leader's relentless attacks without falling back?" Observing closely, the instructor admitted silently, "What a surprise. His defense holds stronger than I originally anticipated. For a 17-year-old, his swordsmanship shows remarkable precision. His techniques surpass even trained senior cadets' abilities today." However, the instructor narrowed his eyes. Something felt off. Rudd's breathing shifted, his posture subtly preparing something dangerous. Rudd staggered slightly, his guard weakening. Pain surged through his arms, yet his feet held firm. Above, a senior student sneered confidently. "That's as far as he can go," he declared arrogantly. Breathing heavily, Rudd muttered, "Adults in this era really don't know how to take things lightly." From across the arena, the instructor smirked. "Oh my, Rudd. Are you tired already?" he teased mockingly. Rudd's eyes blazed with renewed determination. Despite the exhaustion, he clenched his fists and prepared another attack. Rudd's hand began glowing faintly. A hidden technique awakened, channeling concentrated energy directly through his clenched fist. With a powerful leap, Rudd charged forward. His fist cut through the air, trailing radiant energy lines. The instructor's confident expression faded. His body instinctively shifted defensive, sensing a dangerous and unexpected incoming strike. For a split second, their eyes locked. The instructors widened, realizing he had completely misjudged Rudd's capability. Rudd's energy-infused strike connected perfectly. The resulting shockwave hurled the instructor backward, ending the intense battle immediately. Rudd's fingers brushed the shattered wooden sword fragments. Despite exhaustion, a determined spark remained in his eyes. Above, a spectator commented coldly, "Judging by that technique, he must have learned directly under that useless Daniel." Rudd smirked faintly, wiping blood from his lip. "What good for nothing?" "That man is my master," he whispered. The instructor leaned over the balcony, smiling. "Oh my, Rudd, stop sitting around and take your reward." From the distance, the white-haired girl narrowed her eyes. "I knew that punk was strong," she admitted. She bit her lip slightly. "Despite my expectations, I can't believe Rudd is sparring that fiercely." Confused, she pressed her hand against her chest. So, what's this feeling building up inside me? Her thoughts tangled. Is this jealousy or inferiority? I understand others' feelings easily, but my own confuse me. From below, Rudd glanced up, smiling slightly. Revenge sounds tempting, ma'am. But I've already won this match. The instructor tilted his head, clearly surprised. Huh? His eyes followed Rudd's calm, confident exit from the arena. Rudd tilted his head playfully. Didn't you just use mana outside your body? Seems suspicious. Realization hit the instructor suddenly. His eyes widened, remembering the forbidden technique he unconsciously unleashed under pressure. From above, a cadet sighed. Leader, seriously? I knew this embarrassing situation would happen eventually. The elder instructor covered her face, sighing heavily. That fool. He really can't control himself sometimes, huh? Rudd smirked confidently. Don't tell me the Dragon Annihilation Troop's leader is going back on her word? The instructor laughed awkwardly. Haha, of course. Ask anything you want. There's no denying it now. But nothing too expensive, okay? He added nervously. Rudd simply shook his head, smiling calmly. I'm fine. From above, the white-haired girl sighed quietly. And it's a man that unsettles my emotional equilibrium again. She recalled past battles. Even unrelated by blood, their bond resembles fierce siblings, like those swordmasters previously encountered. Rudd stared toward the balcony. I've never beaten her, but this might be my closest chance to victory. Silence fell over the arena. The instructor took a deep breath, struggling to compose his thoughts. With a sharp flick, he confidently raised his finger, signaling his challenge under the same previous conditions. Eyes firm and unwavering, he spoke clearly. Please spar against me again. Under the same rules. Wooden blades clashed again, echoing loudly through the arena as the rematch began with full force. Each strike came faster than before. The audience held their breath, witnessing their speed and precision escalate. The instructor narrowed his eyes. So there's a reason he confidently asked for the second match. He tightened his stance, watching Rudd carefully. The atmosphere around him, it's nothing like the first round. A faint grin appeared. Shall I verify it myself? He thought, stepping forward with renewed aggression. The instructor dashed forward aggressively, closing the distance with remarkable speed, his blade aimed directly at Rudd's chest. Mid-charge confusion struck. What the hell? His reaction speed suddenly increased beyond normal human comprehension. Despite the surprise, he pressed on. Still, there's no way he'll completely dodge this final attack. Yet as their weapons crossed, he realized instantly. There's no gap? He's already matching my best movements. Rudd's calm expression didn't change. His breathing's off. This fight's already over. He hasn't realized it yet. Rudd's mind cleared. You said only experience defines skill. Then watch as I break through limitations now. His eyes sharpened. Mana surged throughout his body. This was the hidden trump card extreme sense activation. Using mana to overload sensory input, Rudd's perception accelerated. Every motion registered precisely within his heightened awareness. He lunged forward again, faster than before. Muscles strained under pressure, but his form remained perfectly balanced. Even back then, I wanted to defeat Leon using this. His final strike headed straight forward. Rudd advanced sharply, his blade aiming directly for a clean hit before his opponent could react properly. The instructor analyzed quickly. He's controlling his breathing perfectly. His movement remains smooth despite tremendous internal strain. I've never seen anyone strike like that while defending their vital areas simultaneously, the instructor thought nervously. He repositioned immediately. Still, it's not like his attack is completely unblockable. I can handle this. But before his thoughts settled, Rudd's strike landed precisely. The echo of victory resounded across the arena. Rudd barely dodged the incoming strike, sweat dripping. His opponent's aggression increased dramatically without any hesitation. A violent clash erupted. Blades crossed fiercely, shockwaves rippling outward, drawing gasps from everyone in attendance. Spectators whispered nervously. Damn, there she is, the divorcer. How brutal, one muttered with clear concern. Come on, aren't you going to counter, or are you just planning to keep running away? Rudd steadied his breathing, eyes focused. The real counterattack was coming, but at the perfect moment. The instructor clenched his teeth. His next strike would decide everything. He couldn't lose this final exchange. With a loud roar, both fighters charged forward simultaneously, their final moves prepared with absolute focus. I got her! The instructor thought triumphantly, seeing an opening just before their blades collided violently. But Rudd twisted his body gracefully. His counterattack flowed like water, redirecting the force with precision. With a final shout, Rudd unleashed his strongest technique, his blade cutting through the air flawlessly. Rudd suddenly released his sword mid-combat, startling his opponent and drawing everyone's attention to his movement. The crowd gasped as energy surged. This wasn't retreat, it was a high-level technique rarely countered successfully. With a confident grin, Rudd pivoted his stance, eyes locked as his opponent rushed to react instinctively. Exploding forward, he ducked low and struck his opponent's ribs with precision, knocking the wind from him. As his rival staggered backward, Rudd readied himself again, momentum fully in his favor with no hesitation. She strike connected cleanly, Drawing blood, his opponent had clearly underestimated the risk of closing distance. She assessed quickly his enemy attempted a retreat, likely planning to recover and retaliate with increased strength. With narrowed eyes, Rudd whispered a spell, but paused as he noticed something strange in the air. Confused, he scanned the space his opponent had vanished without a sound, as if erased from existence. She pivoted defensively, feet digging into cracked stone, sensing danger. The enemy was nearby and preparing something big. The enemy emerged from the cracked ground, striking upward with force, catching Rudd completely off guard mid-thought. Rudd realized too late it was the earth tremor technique, executed with fierce accuracy from below his stance. His opponent advanced swiftly, knowing a single moment of disruption could determine the battle's outcome entirely. The punch landed cleanly on Rudd's side, his breath catching from the sudden calculated burst of force. With momentum gained, the enemy lunged forward. Not wasting time, he aimed to end it all now. The attacker stabilized himself, aura swirling around his limbs, preparing to continue the fight without hesitation. Rudd gritted his teeth and forced himself up, pain pulsing sharply through his side and leg. From across the hall, a girl cried out his name, worry clear in her urgent voice. She sprinted toward him, scolding loudly, frustrated that he kept pushing beyond his limits like a reckless fool. She caught her breath and glared, demanding to know why he fought so hard without thinking straight. Rudd smiled weakly, assuring her he wasn't crying and that the fight wasn't truly lost. Confused by his words, she turned to see the opponent standing calmly across the training hall. The opponent took a breath, eyes thoughtful as he absorbed the outcome without bitterness or denial. She looked up and admitted defeat, voice steady, accepting the result with surprising grace and clarity. Gasps erupted around them. No one expected him to concede. The crowd buzzed with disbelief and amazement. The opponent smiled and offered a promise, asking if he should treat Rudd's request seriously now. Rudd stepped forward, voice firm. He didn't need reasons, just wanted a promise for one future moment. "Promise?" the opponent asked, confused. Rudd nodded, wanting trust more than answers, even if it sounded absurd. Still uncertain, the opponent asked why this mattered. Rudd stayed quiet, gaze steady but unwilling to explain. The opponent stared, thoughtful. The silence lingered between them as the girl nearby watched without interrupting. The leader exhaled calmly, a faint smile on his lips as he considered the unusual request. He reached out firmly, vowing as Dragon Annihilation troop leader to uphold the promise without fail. Grinning, he joked about being replaced by the younger generation but welcomed the chance to cooperate. With a playful smirk, he added son-in-law, leaving Rudd and the girl both shocked and speechless. A red sky loomed while dragons rose from twisted realms, their silhouettes blotting out the burning heavens. The wailing dragon emerged, its presence unsettling the balance of light and fear across the distant lands. Urjin, the elusive dragon, would strike next, unseen by most, but devastating in each unexpected appearance. Another dragon loomed over the capital, ready to erase everything beneath it without mercy or hesitation. A massive conflict would follow, but despite the fear, this time not everyone would die in vain. Rudd planned carefully. His alliance with the Dragon Annihilation Troop would let him preempt the next attack. He believed warning them early could change the outcome. Even the doomed one's future might shift unexpectedly. Just then, the girl approached quickly, noticing his distracted state and calling out to regain attention. Startled, Rudd snapped back to reality, unsure how to respond without revealing too much of his thoughts. She sighed, frustrated, teasing him about overreacting to a joke, others nearby already gossiping and laughing together. She joked again, telling him to relax and stop acting like a prisoner out in public. He replied calmly, saying her mother seemed to like him, which surprised him more than the bruises. Leaning back, Rudd admitted it was worth the punch, his expression softening as he spoke honestly. She asked about his injury. He replied it hurt, but refused to take any medicine again. The carriage arrived at Iridium, final stop. Together, they stepped out under a fading, quiet sky. She asked again if he would come along next time, concerned about his safety and strength. He hesitated at first, giving no clear answer, while she pouted and pressed him for confirmation. She repeated herself, annoyed by his silence, but he casually deflected again with a vague, "We'll see." Noticing her walking beside him, he asked why, reminding her the girl's dorm was in the opposite direction. She replied bluntly that she was escorting him instead, mentioning strange rumors circulating through the academy. She shared a strange rumor about a fervent student appearing naked near the dorm entrance at night. Rudd paused, unsure how to react, imagining the bizarre scenario with growing disbelief and secondhand embarrassment. She continued nonchalantly, recalling another rumor about a mysterious blonde girl roaming the Central Park flower field. He blinked, confused and surprised by her casual tone, unsure if she believed any of it herself. Under the moonlight, he leaned in slightly, asking curiously and seriously, "Tell me more about that." Rudd entered the office respectfully, addressing the advisor with a polite tone as he stepped inside. Advisor Lillian Stout acknowledged him, her serious expression not changing as she gestured him toward the desk. Rudd thanked her for the time and said he came with a question about a student. He clarified that he wanted to ask about Linnea Zekine, concerned over her recent behavior shift. Lillian responded plainly it was a small issue, but she had also noticed Lenia's change in attitude. The advisor flipped through documents, her expression shifting as she recalled a growing list of troubling incidents. Rudd called out in concern, but she suddenly stood, declaring that Lenia's behavior wasn't minor at all. Skipping meals, sleeping on rooftops, swimming in fountains and barbecues on rooftops were serious problems in her eyes. Slamming the desk, she cried out in frustration, claiming she'd exhausted every method of guidance and reason. As she screamed Lenia's name dramatically, Rudd awkwardly stepped in, urging the professor to please calm down. The professor exhaled slowly, returning to her seat after the outburst, trying to regain her composure. She admitted with a sigh that she might have overreacted and let emotions get the better. Rudd silently noted how stressed she must have been to act so dramatically over a student's behavior. She explained Lenia's talent, highlighting her natural affinity for spirits despite her unorthodox and carefree personality. Confidently, she concluded that Lenia would grow into an exceptional spirit user, given time and trust. She threw paper airplanes during exams and once escaped class through a window, just to find food. Lenia even destroyed a training hall while experimenting with unstable spirit magic, shocking both teachers and students. The advisor lamented staying awake for days, struggling to repair the damages and maintain her sanity. Rudd was stunned, realizing her chaos somehow exceeded even the harshest battle drills he'd ever endured. In a low voice, someone confessed that helping Lenia graduate was harder than years of combat training. Rudd questioned the dramatic claims, wondering if everyone was just exaggerating Lenia's troublemaking a little too much. The man beside him paused, fire crackling, and admitted there was something deeper he needed to say. He confessed that Lenia once felt more like a force of nature than just an ordinary person. Still, despite everything, the professor didn't want her unique spirit abilities and natural gifts to go unused. Turning serious, she pressed Rudd, insisting there must be a deeper reason for his interest in Lenia. Rudd tried to play it off, claiming he was only worried about her strange behavior lately. He stood quickly, emphasizing his concern as a reasonable effort to protect national honor and future talent. The advisor leaned in with a grin, suggesting dramatic action to preserve Lenia's potential and reputation. Caught off guard, Rudd stammered, unsure how to respond to her sudden shift in tone and energy. He admitted Lenia ignored adults, but also noted no one ever genuinely praised her in the first place. Rudd panicked as the advisor clung to him, pushing responsibility onto him without room to argue. She insisted Lenia wouldn't graduate like this and asked if he planned to just walk away. Rudd hesitated, unsure how to respond. But the advisor declared confidently she was leaving this to him. As a butterfly drifted past the window, Rudd wondered if this moment had already been decided. The butterfly glided into the sunlit sky nearby. Lenia hummed quietly, unaware her life was about to change. Lenia stretched across the grass, eyes closed, enjoying the breeze, completely unaware of the responsibility approaching her. A group of students noticed Lenia lying openly in the field, puzzled by her unusual behavior. They questioned if she was even conscious, watching her nap peacefully without a care in the world. Despite the confusion, one student sighed, admiring her calm appearance under the sunlight as others gathered curiously. Someone joked she looked like the prettiest homeless person, drawing chuckles and nods from the group nearby. Rudd overheard, thinking to himself they weren't wrong. Lenia was half human, half spirit, and completely unpredictable. Rudd approached Lenia, mumbling that she needed to act more human in the human world. Lenia kept dozing, completely unbothered by the world around her or his approaching footsteps and voice. He crouched beside her and shouted, trying to wake her up from her midday nap. She twitched slightly, but then suddenly rolled away with surprising speed and fell into the flower patch. A startled scream burst out as she disappeared into the tall grass, leaving Rudd blinking in silence. Lenia sat up from the grass, confused, leaves in her hair and questions in her eyes. She asked what he was doing there so early, blinking like nothing unusual had just happened. Rudd stayed calm, watching her curious expression as she claimed she'd only been admiring the flowers. He introduced himself formally as Rudd Donatos, a first-year student visiting on behalf of advisor Lillian. Lenia beamed, teasing him for being her junior, then asked casually what business he had today. Rudd handed her a letter. Nervously, he explained it was from advisor Lillian. Nothing personal. Lenia smiled and joked, asking if he admired her because she looked cool or wanted friendship. Rudd grew suspicious. Was she always like this, dodging topics and twisting conversations into unpredictable nonsense? Before he could respond, Lenia shouted something strange and bolted across the field without another word. Flustered, Rudd stood and shouted after her, demanding she take the letter. His task had just begun. Lenia suddenly stopped and asked bluntly what Rudd meant by the strange phrase he just used. Caught off guard, Rudd hesitated before awkwardly explaining that it was just some kind of chant. He brought up her behavior, skipping classes, making messes, saying it'd be sad to see her fail. Lenia tilted her head, surprised, genuinely wondering if she had caused that much chaos without realizing. Rudd reminded her of the destroyed drill hall. Even the person responsible didn't remember the damage. Rudd nervously glanced at her. As she cheerfully recalled the incident, nobody got injured, she said. But Rudd frowned. Injury's not the issue, he muttered. You caused chaos just for your amusement. She waved off his concern. Fine, let's compromise. But why do you keep skipping class? Rudd looked up, confused. Her glasses glinted. Why should I graduate? He asked, genuinely uncertain, surprising her. He stood, gazing at the academy. This place is peaceful. My hometown was always buried in snow. She twirled happily on the grass. I like this place. I'd live here forever if possible. Rudd narrowed his eyes. Senior, do you even understand what Academy Artium is meant for? It's a dragon extermination institution, he said. Graduates become warriors. Many have died beyond these safe walls. She paused, thoughtful. Dragons kill humans. Humans kill dragons. Isn't it natural? Just part of the world? Rudd clenched his fist. Do you actually believe dragons and humans are the same kind of creature? She replied calmly. They are. What makes them any different? Her gaze remained steady on Rudd. Rudd stood silent. Memories returned, flames, screams, and loss. You won't understand, not from your peaceful world. Unlike the academy, he continued, my home had no walls. We lived with death around us. Humans were hunted. Entire villages wiped out. Dragons slaughtered indiscriminately, no reason, no mercy, only destruction. He saw his younger self trembling beside ashes. That's why I became a dragon slayer. She looked at him confused. Why are you angry at me now? She asked softly. Rudd turned away, biting back frustration. Damn it all, he muttered, unable to contain his irritation. I'd rather talk to a wall, he snapped. You're worse than I thought, completely ignorant. She lowered her gaze. I only came because I was curious about my mother's academy. Rudd walked away. Enjoy peace while others die for you. They'll bleed while you wander around carefree. She stood silently, watching Rudd walk away. A sudden breeze brushed past her, cooling her thoughts. She whispered, Dad, hoping for comfort. The air shimmered as a presence began to form. A crystal apparition appeared before her, glowing softly. Yes, my child, it answered in a gentle voice. And she lowered her head. I didn't mean to upset him, I just wanted friendship. The spirit answered, Don't worry. Real connections are built slowly through honesty, not just cheerful words. She smiled brightly. Was it my fault, Father? Her voice was hopeful, seeking honest guidance. And hearing the answer she wanted, she nodded. Okay, I'll apologize to him tomorrow morning. The spirit glowed. Good. And perhaps speak to him sincerely. She looked up. Spirit King Feldra. Meanwhile, Rudd walked aimlessly, lost in thought. His steps were heavy, mind replaying their conversation. He groaned. I meant to warn her, not hurt her. Why is this always difficult with me? Rudd sighed deeply. Regret crept in slowly. Did I just unload everything on a student? He clenched his jaw. I just vented all my anger on a child. That wasn't right. She stared at the ground, eyes wide. His words earlier had clearly left a sharp mark. Rudd thought, my brother might have helped her with warmth, but me? I only know blunt honesty. A shout snapped him back. Rudd, perfect timing, a voice called out amid rising tension nearby. The red-haired girl shouted furiously, how could that girl dare show her face around here again? Her anger grew. She had the nerve to return after injuring someone during their first meeting. The silver-haired girl stood quietly, unfazed. Her golden eyes watched the accusations without blinking or fear. Get lost, you crazy psycho, the girl screamed, pointing sharply. The others stood frozen in awkward silence. Rumors of her violent past resurfaced as a student accused her of injuring someone during training. Despite the accusations, her companion remained calm, remembering how much she had changed since that incident. She firmly denied the claims, explaining the situation had been a misunderstanding that was already resolved peacefully. The silver-haired girl revealed she brought breakfast, showing concern and checking if he recovered from recent injuries. Hearing about the injury, the red-haired girl reacted sharply, surprised and worried by the sudden revelation. Rudd scratched his cheek, thinking carefully. He knew speaking up now could change everything that followed. He clenched his fist, staying silent. Tension rose as the other student accused them of serious misconduct. The accuser declared she would report Rudd and his friend for breaking rules and leaving academy grounds. As things escalated, another student grabbed the red-haired girl suddenly, following an order to detain her immediately. Trying to calm everyone, the silver-haired girl stepped forward and apologized sincerely, defending Rudd's intentions and actions. Angered by being held, the red-haired girl glared upward, her frustration building with every passing second. She snapped, slapped the hand away, and demanded her release. Unwilling to accept humiliation in front of others, after breaking free, she slumped down, exhausted physically and emotionally drained from the chaotic confrontation and arguments. Surprisingly, she smiled and suggested they all become friends. Showing sudden warmth that caught everyone off guard, the silver-haired girl hesitated, confused by the shift. She wasn't sure how to respond to that offer. The red-haired girl mocked her opponent with a smirk. Finding amusement in the silver-haired girl's confusion, the silver-haired girl prepared herself, muttering calmly that she might suffer injury, but she wouldn't back down. Before anything escalated, the tall student stepped in, placing a hand on her shoulder to halt things. She paused, then turned away coldly, saying she was done with this and would now be leaving. Without another word, she walked off. Rudd and the others watched silently, uncertain about what would happen next. The red-haired girl laughed loudly, clearly amused by how serious things had gotten just moments ago. The tall boy sighed and commented on her anger, brushing off the earlier tension like it meant nothing. Rudd listened quietly while the upperclassman casually mentioned being forced into morning community service for unclear reasons. With a sudden breeze, Rudd was left standing alone, thinking about everything that had just unfolded. And so, the day ended at Dragonslayer Academy with tension, misunderstandings, and an uncertain road ahead. The lecture ended, and students prepared to leave. The professor reminded them to submit reports next class. Chatter filled the lecture hall as students packed up, voices blending into the hum of casual noise. Rudd reached for his belongings quietly, unaware that someone nearby was already approaching his desk with purpose. Startled by the presence, Rudd turned and greeted the person behind him with a hesitant, polite, "Hello." A blonde girl stood there calmly. Rudd blinked. "Lenia? What is it?" he asked, slightly confused. Lenia cheerfully invited Rudd to join her for lunch. He looked surprised but agreed without protest. Outside, the sky was clear and calm, an ideal setting for the quiet meal they had planned. The grill sizzled with freshly cooked meat. The air carried the scent of seasoned food across the terrace. Rudd sat quietly with a fork in hand, unsure of Lenia's intentions but choosing to wait. Focused and silent, Lenia flipped the meat carefully, showing a rare side of herself, calm, patient, and precise. Lenia smiled confidently while seasoning the grill, clearly enjoying the chance to show off her cooking skills. Rudd watched her work and muttered to himself, confused by how seriously she took the barbecue. Looking around the rooftop, Rudd questioned why they were eating so far from the usual student areas. Lenia explained matter-of-factly that grilling inside would fill classrooms with smoke and disrupt afternoon lessons completely. She handed Rudd a perfectly grilled piece, insisting he eat it while hot. Her barbecue reputation was serious. As they ate quietly, Lenia slid another portion to Rudd, signaling she had something serious to say. She paused, then softly apologized while poking at her food, clearly still thinking about what happened yesterday. Rudd looked surprised by her sudden apology. Unsure how to respond to such a direct expression, Lenia admitted her mistake, realizing Rudd's actions came from genuine concern, not recklessness or selfishness during the mission. She revealed she wasn't fully human, acknowledging that her strange behavior might have confused or unsettled Rudd. Rudd gulped quietly, choosing his words carefully. He knew this moment might shift Lenia's perspective significantly. He spoke honestly, saying he worried because a talented and beautiful upperclassman was struggling to graduate successfully. Rudd encouraged her, saying she could gain respect and friendship by following rules and staying consistent. Lenia fidgeted, surprised by the praise. No one had ever said she was admired or respected before. Rudd wiped his mouth, smiling slyly. He hadn't expected flattery to work so easily on her. Lenia reached out with a bright smile, her mood completely lifted by Rudd's earlier encouraging words. They shook hands across the table. Rudd politely thanked her for the invitation and the thoughtful meal. Motivated, Lenia vowed to attend class regularly and improve her grades, hoping to earn his respect. Rudd affirmed her decision, promising support. But before she could respond further, he added one final condition. Lenia froze mid-sentence as Rudd leaned forward, calmly but firmly declaring he had one specific request first. Lenia casually asked if Rudd would like to meet her father, as if it were routine. Rudd froze in shock, confused by her sudden request, and unsure what she meant by father. Lenia laughed and reassured him with a smile, claiming her father wasn't scary, just a regular person. She added with a flash of pride that her father was actually the king of spirits. In that moment, Rudd was overwhelmed by magical pressure, suddenly trapped inside a freezing crystalline spirit prism. The icy crystal hovered midair, radiating quiet power. Inside, Rudd remained still, watching everything unfold carefully. From within the crystal, a deep voice politely requested Lenia to step away for a private talk. Lenia nodded casually, agreeing without hesitation, and stood up to give them space without asking further questions. She walked away slowly. The rooftop grew quieter as the spirit's attention shifted entirely toward Rudd. Standing and bowing respectfully, Rudd introduced himself to Peldria, the Ice Spirit King, without showing any fear. Rudd's expression tensed as the spirit's voice echoed, asking a question only he truly understood the weight of. He raised his eyes to meet the spirit, silently confirming the truth. He had returned to change everything. The spirit crystal surged with energy, reacting to Rudd's presence and the confirmation of his time shift. Rudd gulped and asked cautiously, wanting to know how the spirit discovered his return to the past. The spirit explained that two worlds, spirit and human, are distinct, but great changes can echo across both realms. Spirits who remain near the boundary lose clarity. Their perception of time and reality slowly becomes unstable. Because he was linked to the realm itself, he couldn't pinpoint Rudd's moment of temporal transition. Rudd looked up at the spirit crystal, gathering his thoughts. As the weight of truth settled in, he sighed and admitted he wasn't special. He simply followed someone else and acted on instinct. The spirit crystal remained still, listening quietly. Rudd accepted that explanations would be necessary moving forward. He offered to recount everything that had happened to humanity from his perspective, not distorted by spirit time. And so, another chapter closed at Dragonslayer Academy. As Rudd prepared to reveal his truth, the spirit sensed a connection. Both the Dragon Slayer and the Dimensional Dragon vanished at the same moment. It suggested that the Dragon Slayer Rudd mentioned was likely still alive somewhere, waiting for a return. Rudd's eyes widened. He asked how the spirit could be so sure of that possibility. The spirit explained the dragon wasn't fatally wounded. It retreated, likely to recover instead of facing defeat. It also revealed Rudd's brother, a Dragon Slayer, was dragged into the dimension alongside that fleeing enemy. Rudd's expression hardened. He gripped the table, realizing just how close his brother's trail might be. The spirit asked if Rudd had searched Santino's Nest, a legendary island rumored to hold lost things. Rudd admitted he hadn't. He needed to prepare. First, stronger enemies and greater chaos were still coming. Determined, Rudd asked the spirit if it remembered when time itself had been reversed in their world. The spirit recognized the event, confirming a dragon had used magic to alter time but hesitated to say more. Rudd pondered deeply. The Spirit King's silence was absolute. Who was this mysterious, time-altering dragon? He sighed, acknowledging that an oath-bound spirit couldn't speak further. He accepted there was nothing more possible. But the spirit wasn't finished. It now had a question for Rudd, one filled with personal pain. The spirit asked what happened before time reversed. How had his daughter lost her life back then? Rudd answered solemnly, revealing the truth. She was killed by the Ice Jade Dragon Nephrin before everything reset. Rudd explained Lenia's fate. She sealed herself inside the Ice Jade Dragon to protect others from destruction. The spirit quietly accepted the truth, recognizing Lenia's smile and sacrifice as a choice made with resolve. He declared Rudd the only one capable of changing fate. Now his daughter's hope lived through him. Rudd admitted his doubts, not even a dragon slayer, but swore to change what he still could. The spirit crystal responded with a powerful crackle, committing to help rewrite his daughter's future alongside Rudd. Rudd sat frozen as the crystal hovered silently. The air pulsed with building magic and intent. With a final crack, the Spirit King spoke. He would entrust everything to Rudd from this moment. A sudden gust hit the terrace. Rudd stood startled as the chair behind him was knocked over. A cold wave surged toward his hand. The spirit's voice echoed gently, assuring him to remain calm. Rudd's eyes widened. The sensation was familiar. He trembled slightly, recognizing the touch of a power he once knew. Rudd coughed violently as spiritual energy surged through him. A shard of spirit power entered his chest. Despite the pain, Rudd understood this shard held power. Accepting it meant protecting Lenia and her future. He staggered back, feet unsteady. The sudden bond formed between spirit and human was dangerously unstable inside him. Rudd shouted angrily, rejecting what happened. He never agreed to a contract or spirit fusion with anyone. His frustration flared. He demanded answers. How could they fuse spirit essence without permission or warning in return? Rudd stood firm, gripping his chest, his body still pulsing from the raw impact of spirit fusion. He gasped for breath as the crystal fragments around him shattered, releasing the lingering energy into air. Furious, Rudd yelled at the spirit, trembling. He believed the reckless transfer nearly ended his life. Unbothered, the spirit calmly replied survival was what mattered. The bond was formed, and now he had access. The spirit's voice echoed no matter where he went. Rudd could now summon its power and guidance. Rudd tried to speak casually, but the crystal spirit blurted out his secret without any hesitation. Both Rudd and the spirit froze in panic as Lenia returned unexpectedly, overhearing part of the conversation. Lenia looked suspicious. She said she only came back because they were taking too long outside. She leaned in closer. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something off about Rudd's scent and presence. Lenia remarked bluntly Rudd now smelled like ice, a sharp change from how he smelled earlier that day. Rudd played it cool, joking that her father was easygoing and even let him speak casually. Lenia reacted with cheerful surprise, completely buying his explanation, impressed by how fast they became buddies. The spirit hovered in silence, confused by Rudd's casual attitude and unexpected choice of friendly words. Lenia laughed loudly, praising Rudd's talent for friendship, even with someone from centuries before their time. Rudd smirked, reminding the spirit he still owed payback for inserting a soul shard without permission. Lenia promised to work harder in class. Rudd smiled, pleased to see her take it seriously. The spirit grumbled quietly, calling Rudd a punk for embarrassing him in front of his own daughter. Days passed. Rudd slowly adjusted to life with a soul shard fused deeply into his body. Inside the academy, someone reminded Rudd about his study session with a professor's daughter in the library. Just as Rudd turned to go, another student appeared with unexpected news. He brought Rudd a letter. Inside the envelope was an ancient document, covered in unknown symbols and sealed with a magic crest. Rudd recognized the sender, Abel White, leader of Twilight Moon Guild, who once attacked him before. The letter contained Abel's promised report on Aesir, confirming he'd investigated the case thoroughly before disappearing, but the report held no trace of Aesir. Not a single confirmed lead or location remained. Rudd concluded Aesir was likely trapped in another dimension, one linked to the dimensional dragon Suxalan's vanishing. Now holding the letter, Rudd weighed his next move. He had two clear options before him. Rudd's first option involved tracking unstable mana spikes, but both locations were vast and unexplored by humans. The second path led to Santine's nest, a place of legends and rumored dimensional tiers between timelines. He admitted both choices were difficult. Tracing faint mana or surviving Santine's defenses would challenge any adventurer. Rudd sighed, wondering if a powerful mage existed who could manipulate space or decode dimensional rifts effectively. The spirit spoke. He remembered a human woman from the past with rare dimensional magic worth investigating. As Rudd entered the library, Lenia suddenly appeared with a bright smile, having sensed him nearby. She proudly declared her intent to study, hoping Rudd would be impressed by her improved discipline. A librarian slammed a book shut, shushing them harshly, reminding them that noise wasn't tolerated in there. Another voice chimed in. It was the red-haired girl, clearly irritated, and demanding to know Rudd's excuse. Frustrated, she scolded Rudd for leaving her to supervise the two most chaotic students on campus. Rudd remained quiet while the tension grew. Lenia pouted, feeling misunderstood in front of her peers. The red-haired girl fired back, asking sharply if Lenia had been held back a school year. Lenia snapped defensively, insisting her grade delay had nothing to do with intelligence or academic performance. An awkward silence settled across the library as the group sensed they'd drawn unwanted attention again. Suddenly, Rudd heard a voice in his mind. Was it the spirit or a magical domain? Rudd received the message and acknowledged it quietly. He prepared himself to move toward the next task. He approached the sleeping upperclassman and poked him gently, trying to rouse him without disturbing the others. The student blinked groggily and greeted Rudd, still half asleep. Confused by the sudden need to wake up, Rudd explained briefly he had to step out, and someone needed to keep the group in check. Still dazed, the student muttered in disbelief. They barely knew each other. What reason would they even fight? Rudd gave one last instruction: stop any fighting if it starts, and keep things under control. As he walked off, the red-haired girl shouted after him, frustrated he was leaving already. Rudd explained he was summoned by Professor Guji, and promised to return as soon as possible. Lenia cheerfully waved goodbye, while the upperclassman sighed and mumbled about how annoying Rudd could be. Irritated, the red-haired girl snapped when asked about her mood, denying she was angry while clearly seething with rage.